Hello once again. So today we are going to look at the next section in chapter 2 of my book, Unreasonable Faith, in which I provide a critique of William Lane Craig's arguments for Christianity. This recording is a reading and additional commentary on the book, and I'm happy that I'm getting a chance to record this sooner than I thought. I've got a bit of extra time this week, so I'm able to put out the installments more quickly than I had anticipated. So we will see how far we get. Let's get ready here. So just a reminder. So I'm going to be reading through this next section of the book. I'll read through most of what's here, although occasionally I may skip a few sections if I think they're not as important or want to move on. And also I'll provide some extra commentary to liven it up a bit and add some additional insights that maybe I've had since I wrote the book. And the plan today is to try to get through premise 2 of Craig's argument, the Kalam Cosmological argument. So let me just set the stage of where we got up to last time. So we're working our way through chapter 2 here, the Kalam Cosmological argument. Oh, let's turn those comments off. The 4 premises of the extended form of the Kalam Cosmological argument that I'm using as a way to address all of the aspects of the argument kind of at once. Those 4 premises are listed here. The first premise, that time is tensed, so things can begin to exist in an absolute objective sense of coming into being. That's what we talked about in the previous video. So the first premise of the argument here, you can see in the outline. So we've already covered that. We're now going to move on to the second premise, that the universe began to exist. Now, this wording is important because when Craig says begins to exist, he means begins in an absolute objective coming into being sense. He doesn't just mean it has an earliest time point or something like that. We will cover that in a bit more detail. But that's why it's important to consider premise 2 in the light of premise 1, the philosophy of time. So henceforth, we will be assuming, unless otherwise discussed, that time is tensed in the way that Craig says in order to understand Craig's argument here. All right, let us jump to that section and begin the section on premise 2. In his second key premise of the Kalam cosmological argument, when Craig refers to the universe, he says that he is referring not just to the part of the universe that we can currently see and interact with. This is what cosmologists call the observable universe. But he is referring to all of material reality that exists as part of time and space. So in saying that the universe began to exist, what Craig means is that the totality of material existence had an absolute beginning at some time in the finite past, before which, of course, there was no before, but there was no prior to that point in time, and there was no universe or time or space or anything like that prior to that first point in time. Craig presents 3 distinct arguments in favor of this contention that the universe began to exist. So the first is the impossibility of an actual infinite, as in the actual infinite number of past events that would have had to have elapsed if the universe was infinite in the past. The impossibility of forming an actual infinite by successive addition, which is the impossibility of kind of reaching the present, so to speak, through an infinite past. And finally, empirical evidence from science, specifically cosmology, for the beginning of the universe. The first of these 2 arguments are philosophical, and the third of the arguments is scientific in that it appeals to results of scientific inquiry. Craig says that each of the arguments stands independently of the others, so we need to address all of them in order to fully respond to what Craig has to say. Okay, so let's begin then with the first of these arguments, the impossibility of an actual infinite. Just open this section up here. An actual infinite is something that is infinitely large and exists fully and totally in reality all at once. It is distinguished from a potential infinite, which refers to any situation where something can increase or grow without a limit, so like forever, but at any point in time is always finite. So Craig believes that the future is potentially infinite. Since time could continue without limit forever, even though at any point in time, only a finite number of events would ever have elapsed. So there's no point in the future, there's no time in the future where, according to Craig, you can look back and say, oh, an infinite number of events has now elapsed. So that's the difference that Craig draws between a potential and an actual infinite. So an actual infinite is already like all there, all at once, existing in totality as a whole at one point in time. If the universe never began to exist, but existed forever into the past, then Craig argues that this would amount to there being an actually infinite number of past events, since all these past events must have already elapsed in order to reach the present. Craig's primary method of defending his premise that the universe began to exist is by arguing that an actually infinite past cannot exist, since an infinite past would entail various absurdities. So he's going to appeal to these different absurdities here. Craig here is not arguing that an actual infinite is logically inconsistent, as he says that viewed in abstracto, so abstractly, there is no logical contradiction involved in any of these enormities. End quote. Rather, he contends that when applied in concrete situations like the real world, the concept of an actual infinity leads to absurd results. So even if it's not a logical impossibility, actual infinities cannot exist in reality. Another way to put this is that Craig is arguing that an actually infinite quantity or amount of something is metaphysically impossible, not logically impossible. So we can summarize this argument succinctly in this syllogism. Premise 1, it is impossible for an actual infinite to exist in reality. Premise 2, an infinite temporal regress of events is an actual infinity. Conclusion, the universe cannot be eternal in the past. I suppose you'd need to technically there link the universe being eternal into the past with there being an actual infinite number of past events. We will actually come to that. But Craig is sort of assuming that those go together, or one entails the other. Okay, so let's go through these different issues that Craig brings up to try to defend the idea that it's metaphysically impossible to have an actual infinite. So first, we're going to discuss Cantor's arithmetic. Cantor was a mathematician who introduced a formalism for working with infinite quantities in mathematics. Called transfinite arithmetic, Cantor's results are widely regarded as providing a logically consistent and mathematically sound basis for carrying out operations like addition and multiplication of infinite sets. Sometimes the results of transfinite arithmetic can be very counterintuitive. For example, under Cantor's system, the size of the set of all natural numbers, which is often denoted as this script Z here, so that's the set of 1, 2, 3, and so on, counting up. The size of that set is the same as the size of the set of all odd numbers, so 1, 3, 5, and so forth, even though there are clearly 2 natural numbers for every odd number. In set theory, the cardinality of a set refers, in essence, to the size of that set. It's a formalization of the idea of size. So, for example, the set of the numbers 1, 2, 3, and 5 has a cardinality of 4 because it has 4 elements in it. Cantor wanted to find a way of describing the cardinality of the set of all natural numbers Z. Obviously, there are infinitely many natural numbers, so the cardinality of Z cannot be any number in Z itself. Cantor therefore used a new symbol, which looks like this and is pronounced Aleph naught, to denote the size of the set of natural numbers. This symbol Aleph naught refers to an actually infinite discrete number of things, and so does not have the same meaning as this symbol here, which is typically used in mathematics to refer to infinity as a potential limit. Craig does not dispute that Cantor's arithmetic is logically or mathematically consistent. Rather, his argument rests on the idea that these results only describe abstract mathematical quantities, not anything that exists in reality, since the actual existence of any infinite quantities would lead to absurd conclusions. Appreciate the dono there, no worries. So that's just an introduction to Cantor's arithmetic, which we will be revisiting later, and also to highlight that Craig is not saying that Cantor's arithmetic is false or anything. He's just saying that there can't be any infinitely large sets of things in the real world. We can only imagine them or talk about them abstractly. Okay, so let's now move on to one of Craig's favorite arguments for the impossibility of an actual infinite, which is the problem of Hilbert's hotel. The main thought experiment Craig presents in arguing for the impossibility of the existence of an actual infinite is known as Hilbert's hotel, a hypothetically infinitely large hotel with infinitely many rooms. Craig thinks that the very idea of such a hotel is absurd for a range of different reasons, and as such, an actually infinite hotel like this could not possibly exist in reality. So according to Craig, we can imagine it, but it couldn't really exist in the real world. The paradoxes he discusses include the following. So there's lots of different paradoxes, but let's consider some of them that he presents. If the hotel was initially full, but then suppose a new guest arrived, the new guest could be accommodated by moving the person in room 1 to room 2, and then the person in room 2 to room 3, the person in room 3 to room 4, and so on. infinitely sort of up the chain, thereby creating a vacant room without increasing the number of rooms in the hotel, even though previously all the rooms were full. That's perfectly possible to do with infinite sets. You can kind of move around the elements, so to speak, and thereby like create a room for a new element because the cardinality of the set hasn't changed. After such a new guest arrives, the number of guests in the hotel is the same as before, even though one more guest has moved in. So it's Aleph Nord in both cases, right? If you add 1 to the natural numbers, the set of natural numbers, you haven't changed the size of the set of natural numbers because it's still all the natural numbers. This applies even if infinitely many more guests arrive. So loosely speaking, infinity plus infinity is still infinity, as long as the infinities are still of the same size. I don't think I talk about this here. There are different sizes of infinities, but we don't need to get that into that much detail here. If all the rooms are initially full, and then the guests in every odd-numbered room depart, then there are still infinitely many people in the hotel. So that's the guests in every even-numbered room, even though infinitely many guests have just left, and even though the hotel is now only half full. Further, the proprietor could then move the person in room 2 into room 1, the person in room 4 into room 2, the person in room 6 into room 3, and so forth, because they're only in the even-numbered rooms, and then he moves them all down to the lowest number yet unoccupied room, thereby refilling all the rooms without a single new guest having to enter the hotel. The proprietor of the hotel could begin with a full hotel with an infinite number of guests, move the occupant of room 2 into room 1, so doubling the occupancy of that room, and then move the occupants of rooms 3 and 4 into room 2, so there's now 2 people in room 2 and 3 and 4 are empty, and so on, resulting in a hotel that was still completely full with infinitely many guests, but now there are 2 guests in each room instead of 1, all without any new guests checking into the hotel. So it's almost like we sort of doubled the number of guests in the hotel, even though the number of rooms occupied is the same, and the number of guests in the hotel is actually still the same as before. Very counterintuitive results if you sort of present them this way. But Craig argues that while consistent with the results of Cantor's arithmetic, and so not logically contradictory, so he's not saying there's any logical contradictions here, these scenarios indicate that Hilbert's hotel is just absurd and cannot possibly exist in the real world. Craig also argues that the only absurd thing about Hilbert's hotel is the fact that it is supposed to be infinite, not, for instance, that it's a hotel as opposed to something else. Thus, from the fact that Hilbert's hotel is absurd and could not possibly exist, Craig thinks that we can conclude that an actual infinity of any sort cannot exist in reality. It is important to note that it is obviously physically impossible for Hilbert's hotel to exist in our universe, since the finite observable universe is too small to hold an infinitely large hotel, and you couldn't move an infinite number of people around, in a finite time of the universe, because it would take a finite time for light signals to travel and stuff like that. So obviously, Craig's not just saying it's physically impossible. That's sort of trivial. Rather, Craig's point is that is the much stronger claim that Hilbert's hotel is absurd and therefore metaphysically impossible. So even if somehow there was like a non-physical hotel with non-physical guests, it still wouldn't be possible. So Craig thinks that Hilbert's hotel could not exist in any possible universe, not even one with very different conditions or laws of physics or non-physical guests or whatever. So I'm in agreement with Craig, along with basically all philosophers who think about this, that Hilbert's hotel is very weird, it's strange, it's counterintuitive, it's kind of hard to understand. You just sort of read through these things and you're like, oh, that's kind of odd. So most people agree with this, right? And I agree with Craig. It's counterintuitive and strange. But where I differ is that I don't think that this is a good reason to think that the result is absurd in the sense of like indicating that there's an impossibility here, a metaphysical impossibility. But I don't think that it's metaphysically impossible in the way that Craig says. So let's think about this, right? Suppose that we imagine a different universe with travel and communication being instantaneous. So we can have a hotel that's that's finite in volume, but infinite in capacity, because the guests are non-physical, so they don't take up any space, right? So we're just imagining how we could actually have this hotel. It's non-physical, and so the guests take up zero volume. So in that sort of universe, I think you could have Hilbert's hotel, right? Such a hotel would have could have an infinite number of guests, and then would still have an infinite number of guests, even if some of the guests left, in the way that Craig says. If half the guests left, the hotel would be half empty, but could become full again if the proprietor then moved all of the guests around in the way described here. We have a logically consistent way of describing this, after all, Cantor's arithmetic. So Craig thinks these results are absurd, but I think that we can make perfect sense of these scenarios. In the case of an infinite hotel, to be full simply means that every room is occupied by at least one guest, while to be empty in the sense of not full, not completely empty, just means that at least one room has no guest in it. So the proprietor of our hypothetical non-physical Hilbert's Hotel is at leisure to distribute his infinite number of guests across the infinitely many rooms as he pleases. If he puts all of the guests in one room, so that there's infinitely many in one room and all the other oh, sorry, I got that the wrong way around. If he puts each guest in one room, one guest to one room, then the hotel will be full because there's a direct correspondence between rooms and guests in them, and every room has a guest. Likewise, if he places two guests in each room, it's also full. On the other hand, if he dumps all of the guests in just a single room so that now that room has infinitely many guests in it and all the other rooms are empty, then the hotel is not full. Or alternatively, if he places a guest in every second room, likewise, the hotel is also not full. As Craig acknowledges, there's no contradiction in any of these statements. So where then is the absurdity supposed to arise from? Finite hotels must either gain or lose a guest in order to change between being full or being empty. But this just isn't how infinities work. An infinitely large hotel can go from being full or empty simply by rearranging the guests among the existing rooms. That's how infinities work. It's not like how finite quantities work. Of course, Craig argues that nevertheless we should say that this is absurd, but he doesn't give any argument or explanation why. It's simply his opinion that the results are too strange, and therefore the implication is that actual infinities must be metaphysically impossible. Certainly, an infinite hotel such as this would be very strange to us because we're not used to reasoning with infinite quantities. However, just because something seems counterintuitive or bizarre or strange, it doesn't mean that it's impossible or absurd in the way that Craig means. Craig here is making the claim that such a hotel is absurd, and therefore it's him who needs to articulate precisely why it's absurd, and specifically why it's impossible, which is what he means by absurd, and therefore why a hotel couldn't exist in any imaginable universe. Again, it's not enough to appeal to our intuitions about a real hotel, like in our universe. Obviously, you can't have an infinite hotel in our universe, but the idea is that in any possible universe, including one with like non-physical guests or whatever, Craig is still saying that you can't have an infinite hotel. And the question is, why not? There is no logical inconsistency, and we can make perfect sense of all of the allegedly impossible or absurd statements that Craig cites. The only thing that points to their being absurd is our intuitions, which are obviously not applicable to infinite quantities. However, even if we thought that Hilbert's Hotel was absurd and therefore was metaphysically impossible, it doesn't follow that no actual infinite can exist in reality. So Hilbert's Hotel is only one specific instance or example of an actual infinity. And the fact that one type of actual infinite is impossible doesn't mean that any other type of actual infinity is also impossible. As Landon Hendrick notes, this is especially so given that Craig's Hilbert Hotel at most shows that an infinite number of discrete objects cannot exist. And it's not clear that events or moments of time are objects in this manner. Craig thinks that he is warranted in making a general inference on the basis of this one particular case. So he argues that, quote, if a denumerably actual infinite number of things could exist, they could be numbered and manipulated just like the guests in Hilbert's Hotel. So nothing hangs on the illustrations involving a hotel. The metaphysical absurdity is plausibly attributed to the existence of an actual infinite, end quote. However, this statement is just obviously incorrect. It ignores the possibility that there may be types of actual infinities which are not manipulable in the way that the guests of Hilbert's Hotel are. Remember that all of the alleged absurdities of Hilbert's Hotel involve Craig demonstrating the absurdity through some ability to change, shuffle around, or move or manipulate the infinities. He talks about guests arriving or leaving or being moved between rooms. All of these involve the ability to change around the infinitely many denumerable objects. So this ignores the possibility that there might be actual infinities that you can't manipulate, and so the argument wouldn't be relevant for those. What might an example of such actual infinities be? Well, how about the infinite temporal sequence of events of the past, if the past is infinite? If time is tensed in the way that Craig thinks, moments of time obviously can't be moved around or rearranged or manipulated. I mean, even if it's not tense, they probably can't be, but certainly under a tense view of time where the past doesn't exist. You can't like move events in the past around, shuffle them or anything like that. The past has happened, it's finished. You can't change the order of things. Wes Morrison points this out, arguing, quote, it is metaphysically possible for the guests to be moved in Hilbert's Hotel. It is not metaphysically possible for events to change their temporal locations. So the disanalogy between a Hilbert's Hotel and a beginningless series of events remains in full force, end quote. In response, Craig says, quote, let's suppose Hilbert's Hotel is a hotel where, say, all the rooms are locked so that people can't move out of them. Or maybe there are no doors to the rooms so that you have an infinite number of rooms, one person in each room, but there are no doors. I said that you can still imagine what it would be like for a person in room 1 to be in room 2 and the person in room 2 to be in room 4 and so forth, and you will generate the same absurdities. You don't have to actually go through the trouble of moving the people physically, end quote. So in this modified case of Hilbert's Hotel, it may be more relevant because now we're not appealing to actually moving guests around or anything like that. It does seem here that Craig's actually backing away from his earlier claim that, quote, if an actually infinite number of things could exist, they could be numbered and manipulated. That's what he says up here, right? So here he says that if they actually exist, they could be numbered and manipulated. But now here he's saying, well, maybe they couldn't be, but you could imagine them being manipulated. Well, which is it, Craig? Now, the altered scenario is, at least in my mind, considerably less counterintuitive than Craig's initial scenarios. Here he's only saying that we're now imagining guests moving between rooms. And at least to me, it's much less counterintuitive to think about counterintuitive situations occurring when you imagine moving infinite number of guests to it actually moving them. But that's by and by. Maybe you don't share that intuition. Is there that most of Craig's alleged absurdities in both versions of Hilbert's Hotel derive from two fundamental axioms that we unthinkably accept with respect to finite quantities, but are inconsistent when applied to infinite quantities. So Blake McAllister talks about these two axioms here. Quote, the first is Cantor's principle of correspondence. If one-to-one correspondence exists between two sets, then the number of members in each set is equal. And axiom 2 is Euclid's maxim. The number of members in a set is always larger than the number of members in any of its proper subsets. End quote. So just to try to explain that in layman's terms, one-to-one correspondence means you can sort of find one element of one set and then draw a line from that to one element of another set, and you've got a correspondence between those two, and then you do the same thing for the next element and so forth. And at the end, you've got one line that starts at one element of one set and ends at one element of the other set, and you've got exactly one line between between two elements of the sets. If you can do that without any left over in either sets, then you've got a one-to-one correspondence and no like doubling up of 2-to-1 or 1-to-2. That's a one-to-one correspondence. That's what Cantor's principle of correspondence is, a way of defining when two sets have equal numbers of members or an equal size. Seems pretty intuitive. Euclid's maxim says that a set is larger in size if it is larger than any of its proper subsets. So a proper subset is like, just a smaller set that's part of a larger set. So the odd numbers are a proper subset of all of the counting numbers, of all of the natural numbers, for example. Now, both of these two axioms are very intuitive, and for finite sets, they both apply, right? But they're actually contradictory for infinite sets. You can't have both of these. So only one or the other can be applicable at any one time. And the one that's usually ditched is Euclid's maxim here in Cantor's arithmetic. So demonstrating the incompatibility of these two axioms when applied to infinite sets is straightforward. So let's take the set of all odd integers, which is a proper subset of all the integers. I just said that. But nevertheless, the two can be placed in a one-to-one correspondence with each other. So you just draw a line from, what was it, the odd set of integers? So you draw a line from like 1 to 1, and then from 2 to 3, and then from 3 to 5, and so forth. And you've got a one-to-one correspondence between the integers and the odd integers. So by this principle, it seems like those sets should have the same size. But the set of odd numbers is a proper subset of the set of integers. So it seems by this axiom that the set of integers should be larger. So we get a different answer depending on which axiom we follow, and they can't both be true. So how this is relevant to Hilbert's Hotel is that in appealing to Hilbert's Hotel as a thought experiment, Craig is arguing that the obvious truth that both these axioms must always hold in the real world. If this is true, it follows that infinitely large sets of real-world entities cannot exist. By contrast, Cantor's transfinite arithmetic rejects Euclid's maxim, so it rejects this one here, and thus is able to generate a consistent mathematical treatment of infinite sets, with the side effect of generating some counterintuitive results of the sort that Craig presents in his Hilbert's Hotel problem. So whether these results are sufficiently counterintuitive to justify declaring any actual infinite impossible is, as Craig himself admits, to a considerable degree subjective. While Craig says that he finds them sufficiently troubling, Plausibly, this is largely attributable to a lack of familiarity with the properties of infinite sets. Here's what McAllister has to say about this. Quote, if Craig's thought experiments do not seem intuitively absurd to an individual, as seems to be the case with many philosophers, then he has not offered any independent reason for why that individual should believe the situation to be absurd. It seems reasonable to assume that someone familiar with the branch of transfinite mathematics could view Craig's thought experiments as merely drawing out intriguing implications of actual infinities in the real world. End quote. And just remember here, when we're talking about absurd here, that doesn't just mean like counterintuitive or strange. It means like kind of impossible or indicating something that's kind of gone wrong. So as such, it does not seem to me that the problems of Hilbert's Hotel provide any compelling reason whatever for someone who does not share Craig's intuition about the absurdity of these results to conclude that an actual infinite cannot exist. Essentially here, Craig is just demanding that both of these axioms, Cantor's principle of correspondence and Euclid's maxim, must apply in any real world application or any real world context in all possible universes, because essentially that it concords with his intuitions. But there's just no reason to take that seriously as an argument. I mean, why should we expect our intuitions about infinities to be reliable as a guide to what's possible and what is impossible? Craig just doesn't give any argument as to why that should be the case. All he's able to do is draw out implications of what it would be like to have an infinite hotel if you could have a universe that was able to fit one in, so to speak. And therefore, I just don't think that Craig provides any reasons whatever for thinking that there is for thinking that actual infinities are impossible. And remember, there's also the issue that you can't move past events around like you can move or you could move guests in Hilbert's Hotel around. And Craig's rather lame response to say, well, yeah, but even if you couldn't move past events around, you can imagine moving them around, and that generates the same absurdities, to me just doesn't really seem relevant at all. And what's important is, would there be any actually absurd scenarios that would be generated by the existence of a Hilbert's Hotel? If the only scenarios that would be absurd are imagined scenarios, then I don't really see what the problem is supposed to be. Remember that Craig says that appealing to transfinite arithmetic in general is like imagination, in the sense that it's you can imagine it and you can think about it and talk about it, and that doesn't generate absurdity. It's only when the infinities actually exist or embodied in reality that generates the absurdities. So I'm not quite sure how just imagining that you're moving the guests around or imagining that you move past events around is supposed to generate any absurdities, even under Craig's view, right? Because that's just our imaginations. So I think that's really weak and is pretty much a tacit admission, I think, that really Hilbert's Hotel doesn't really have anything to do with the finitude of the past. Okay, let's talk about another argument that Craig gives against the impossibility of an actual infinite. And this is one that despite being like just provably wrong, about as close as you can get to a mathematical proof of being wrong, Craig still uses this argument, unfortunately. He is still appealing to it. So let's talk about this. Subtraction of infinite quantities. In addition to the previously discussed alleged absurdities of Hilbert's Hotel, Craig presents another objection to the possibility of the existence of an actual infinite. His argument is that while Cantor's system of transfinite arithmetic, inverse operations such as subtraction are prohibited or left undefined, whereas in the real world, there will be nothing preventing, for example, an infinite number of guests from just checking out of Hilbert's Hotel, essentially subtracting themselves from the number of guests in the hotel. So this inability to account for the real possibility of subtraction of infinite quantities, according to Craig, shows that actual infinities cannot exist in the real world. And Craig often appeals to this in quite a vivid way by talking about the idea that, well, you can't stop guests from leaving. If you bar the door, then they'll climb out the windows. And that often elicits a chuckle from the audience. And the idea is that, well, just sort of preventing, just not defining subtraction doesn't somehow prevent guests from leaving. And so therefore there's some sort of absurd problem that emerges if you imagine having an actual infinite in the real world. But this argument is completely wrong. As I said, it's almost demonstrably false in a mathematical sense, because it exhibits a misunderstanding of the meaning of subtraction. So Craig doesn't know what subtraction means, it seems, if he makes this argument. And to be honest, it's not entirely clear. It wasn't obvious to me. I had to think about it for a little bit to sort of realize this. And then I realized that someone else had written about this. I forget. I've got a citation. Yeah, from Louis Swingrover, who's published on this before. But anyway, so let's talk about what subtraction is. To solve the equation x minus y equals z, oh, hang on. Yeah, sorry, I misread that sentence. So in order to solve this equation, x minus y equals z, what we're doing is asking what number added to y will give us x. The answer is z, right? So if what number added to y will give us back x, the answer is z. The reason such an operation cannot be defined in transfinite arithmetic is because when dealing with infinite sets, this equation here has no unique answer. For example, if both x and y are equal to aleph naught, so that's the size of the set of natural numbers, then z here could be any number from 0 up to aleph naught and still satisfy the relation. Since, by the way, transfinite arithmetic works, aleph naught plus 1 equals aleph naught plus 2 equals aleph naught, and so on, including aleph naught plus aleph naught equals aleph naught. This is what I was saying before. If you add two infinities together, as long as they're of the same size, so these are both aleph naught here. Actually, there's an infinite number of infinities. There's aleph 1, aleph 2, and so forth. But we didn't worry about that here. If you add infinity to itself, you get infinity. But also, if you add any finite number to infinity, it's still infinity. So that's all I'm saying here. So in Cantor's arithmetic, subtraction is prohibited for good reason, because it cannot be defined in a general way that yields a single definite answer to this equation. Because if I ask you, what number added to infinity will give you infinity, the answer is, well, any number. So there isn't a unique solution to this equation. So we cannot define subtraction in transfinite arithmetic. It is still possible, however, to meaningfully answer questions which involve specific instances of removing items from infinite sets. For example, let's consider the set of natural numbers, 1, 2, 3, and so forth. Its cardinality is aleph naught, and if all the odd numbers are removed, the remaining subset, which is the even numbers, still has cardinality of aleph naught. We can therefore say that the cardinality of the set of natural numbers with the odds removed is equal to the cardinality of the set of all of the natural numbers. So the cardinality of the set hasn't changed. By contrast, if we take the set of natural numbers and then remove the subset of all numbers greater than 100, the resulting set has a cardinality of 100. So 1 up to 100. I guess I'm excluding 0 here, but 0 is not a natural number, so that's fine. Thus, in any specific case of removing particular elements from an infinite set, we are able to determine the cardinality of the set that is left over. This is called the relative complement, which is denoted like this. So Craig's argument fails because he does not appreciate the difference between the cardinality of the set A minus the cardinality of the set B and the cardinality of the set of A without B. In finite sets, those are always the same, but they're not in infinite sets. So the former refers to the difference in the size of sets A and B and involves the operation of subtraction, which is undefined for infinite sets. So this is not defined for infinite sets. However, the latter refers to the size of the relative complement of sets A and B. So basically, what is left in A once you take out the elements of B. And it is defined and can be carried out even for infinite sets. You can always work out what this is, even for infinite sets. It is only this latter operation that is required for real-world operations involving specific infinite sets. After all, in the real world, we never observe subtraction in the abstract. You never just observe like a threeness leave some quantity. It doesn't make sense, right? All you ever observe are specific instances of taking some items away from a set of others. And then you determine the size of the set of whatever's left over. The problem with Craig's argument, this problem with Craig's argument has been noted, as I just said, by Lewis Swingrover. I don't know if it's Louis or Lewis. Quote, in each operation, Craig describes the production of the relative complement of one well-defined set in another. However, he proceeds to characterize each operation as if it were the subtraction of an undefined infinite quantity from an undefined infinite quantity, and the cardinality of the resultant set as if it were the difference between the two undefined quantities, which is different in each case. This equivocates between the relative complement of one set in another and the difference in their cardinalities. That's what I've said here. The contradictions cannot be reached if the equivocations are not made. The relative complement of a well-defined transfinite set in another well-defined transfinite always yields a unique result. End quote. In any real-world case involving a specific, even an infinite number of guests checking out of the hotel, therefore, the size of the set of guests remaining in the hotel will always be uniquely defined. As such, the fact that the abstract notion of subtraction is not defined for infinite sets has no bearing whatever to undermine the plausibility of an actual infinity existing in reality. Craig is just flat out wrong about that point. It doesn't matter that you can't define subtraction. If what we're worried about is defining how many guests are left in the hotel, you can always do that. All right, let's move on to the next argument that Craig uses, which is an appeal to spatial and temporal intervals. And, well, specifically, this is an objection really to Craig's argument. So one common objection to Craig's argument against the possibility of an actual infinity is that every spatial and temporal interval consists of an infinite number of points. So even like this interval here has an infinite number of spatial points in it, for example. So is that not an actual infinite? Well, here's what Craig says, quote, "This familiar objection gratuitously assumes that space and time are composed of real points and instants, which has never been proven," end quote. Now, here Craig shifts the burden of proof, since he's the one claiming that no actual infinities exist and no actual infinities can exist. Therefore, it's up to Craig to show that space and time, which plausibly are infinitely divisible, cannot be infinitely divide. It's not enough just to say, well, it's never been proven. He needs to show that at least there's good reason to think that space and time are not infinitely divisible in order for his argument to go forward. He goes on to describe his own preferred model of space and temporal intervals as follows, quote, "If one thinks of a geometrical line as logically prior to any points which one may care to specify on it, rather than as a construction built out of points, then one's ability to specify certain points, like the halfway point, for example, does not imply that such points exist independently of our specification of them. Time as duration is then logically prior to the potentially infinite divisions we make of it. Specified instants are not temporal intervals, but merely the boundary points of intervals, which are always non-zero in duration," end quote. So this position meets with a number of difficulties. First, if neither space nor time are composed of points, it's rather mysterious how we're able to just sort of create a division at any arbitrary point by an act of sweeping our hand in an arc and then stopping an operation, or stopping a stopwatch at an arbitrary time. Since there's no limit to the precision at which this can be done, at least as far as we know, let's keep quantum issues out of this for the moment because that's still controversial. Therefore, we seem capable of creating arbitrary divisions in time and space at any point we wish at any time. How are we able to exercise apparently such magical power over time and space if there are no such points that actually exist prior to our intervention? That's just really inexplicable. Like, what are we actually doing there to split up a previously unsplit duration there? At least that doesn't make very much sense to me. Second, Craig's view meets with various absurdities when considering the question of the extent of the present. So that's what I discussed in the last section of the previous premise. So there, Craig argues that the notion of a temporal interval which exists prior to, or I think that's logically prior to, any of the events that exist in the interval just doesn't make any sense, and must collapse into either a tenseless theory of time, where all of the elements of the interval exist in a sense alongside each other, but at different moments of time, or the view that only only the present instantaneous instant exists. I feel like that's redundant there. Probably just say present instant exists. So the former case is inconsistent with the Kalam's dependence on the tense theory of time, so that won't work. And the latter case is inconsistent with Craig's premise that the temporal series of events is formed by successive addition. So this is critical. I mentioned this last time. Craig cannot say that the present is the present instant, because then, first of all, that means that there's an infinite number of temporal and presumably also spatial moments in any finite interval, which completely demolishes this premise that actual infinities are impossible. This argument that actually infinities are impossible. And the other problem is that time won't be, if time is comprised of these infinitesimal moments, then time cannot pass through successive addition, because there is no successor of a real number. If time has a structure of real numbers and you want to go from one to the next, there is no successor. So it doesn't work like that. Therefore, that destroys the second key argument that Craig gives in favor of the fact that the universe is finite, which is the impossibility of forming an infinite by successive addition. So essentially, if time is comprised of instantaneous moments, both of Craig's philosophical arguments for the finitude of the past just go out the window. They don't work. And so that's why Craig has to be very specific about rejecting that as a theory of what the extent of the present is. But as I said, I don't think he can adopt a view of the extent of the present which says that there's like a discrete instance of discrete units of time, chronons, which are the smallest unit you can get, which then go from one to the other. And the reason I don't think he can say that is because I think that he would regard that as a restriction on God's power. It would say that even God can't form an interval in between those, in between like one moment of time and the next, discrete moments. He also makes a few other arguments that we discussed last time. But this is why I think Craig has to defend this ludicrously absurd, nonsensical idea that what what is the present depends on what you refer to as present. And so what you refer to as present then sort of comes into existence, and what exists has a component that's just past, which doesn't exist, and then which is future, which doesn't exist, which I talked about last time. So this is how that linked to his argument for the finitude of the past here. Okay, so Craig also presents a Grim Reaper paradox argument against the possibility of time being composed of instants. Now, people may in the chat and viewing the video subsequently may be familiar with this argument because it has been appealed to quite a lot to argue for the finitude of the past. But Craig actually doesn't appeal to this argument as evidence for the finitude of the past. And the reason is because he can't, right? Because he doesn't think that time is comprised of instantaneous moments. So the Grim Reaper paradox is reliant on that premise that you can subdivide up time into arbitrarily small moments at each of which point different events occur. So Craig is actually going to use the Grim Reaper paradox as an argument against the possibility that time is comprised of moments, not actually against the existence of an actual infinite, which is sort of interesting, but we're going to go through it anyway. So here's the paradox. So you're alive at 12 p.m. Grim Reaper 1 will kill you at 1 p.m. if you are still alive at that time. Grim Reaper 2 will kill you at 12:30 if you are still alive by then. Grim Reaper 3 will kill you at 12:15 if you're still alive at that point, and so on. So there's each one sort of coming progressively halfway between the interval of now and the next one. Such a situation seems clearly conceivable, but leads to an impossibility. You cannot survive past 12 p.m., and yet you cannot be killed at any time past 12 p.m., because there would already have been a Reaper before that to have killed you. So Craig thinks this scenario should be possible if time were composed of instants, because there's an instant in each of these sort of points for the Reaper to come in and kill you. But since it leads to a contradiction, we should conclude that time cannot be composed of instants. The problem with this argument is that it incorrectly identifies the reason for the contradiction as lying with the absurdity of time comprised of instants. Instead, the contradiction is a result of the specification of the situation, which describes a logically impossible scenario. So this is my diagnosis here, which I don't think I use this term, but it's just an inconsistent combination of specifications, right? I forget, there's another word for it that some have used. I think Malpass has used. But it's a logical impossibility, and I think it's fairly easy to demonstrate that. Specifically, what's impossible is the situation and these two claims, saying that you cannot survive past 12, and yet you cannot be killed at any time past 12. It's logically contradictory to assert all of those things. Now, to see why, let's think about the situation here. So there's two key facts here. One, for every Grim Reaper, there is another Grim Reaper who arrives in half the time before they arrive. So that's clearly specified the way this is set up. Two, you will be killed by the earliest Grim Reaper. And that's specified by the fact that it says that each will kill you if you are still alive by them. And it follows that the earliest Grim Reaper will be the one to kill you if any Grim Reaper kills you. And I think that's also sort of follows from what's said here. You cannot survive past 12 p.m. there. So since each Grim Reaper is a distinct entity that's specified in the problem, we can assign each of them a label in accordance with the number of minutes after 12 p.m. they arrive. So Grim Reaper 1 is assigned 60 because he arrives 60 minutes afterwards. 2 is assigned 30. And then we've got 15, 7.5, and so forth. So the set of labels is not arbitrary, but is based on the fact that each Grim Reaper must arrive after a determinate number of minutes, even if it's a fractional number of minutes. So we can give this a formal notation to the set of arrival times. So this is the notation here for the set of arrival times, 60 for the number of minutes in an hour divided by 2 to the power of n, because effectively we're continually halving the arrival times, where n is an element of the set in the set of positive integers. So not including 0, but every number above that, because we're halving to infinity, so to speak. So this describes the set of arrival times of the Reapers in this scenario. So the first postulate about Grim Reapers is therefore equivalent to saying that for each number in our set A, there is also a number in that set equal to half its size, half the magnitude of each of these numbers. The second postulate states that there is a smallest number in the set A corresponding to the number of minutes after 12 p.m. that the Grim Reaper who kills us arrives at. So that's this statement here. You will be killed by the earliest Grim Reaper, which corresponds to saying you cannot survive past 12 p.m. So that corresponds to saying, along with the rest of the setup of the scenario, that we will be killed by the earliest Grim Reaper, therefore that there is a smallest element of this set. The Grim Reaper problem, therefore, effectively states that you will be killed by the Grim Reaper that bears the smallest number in a set that has no smallest number. This set does not have a smallest number in it. It keeps getting smaller and smaller, but there is no smallest element. So it's unbounded. Well, I should specify that. None of the elements are less than 0. They're all positive, but there is no smallest element. By this analysis, we see that the Grim Reaper paradox, in fact, describes not a paradoxical situation, one that's absurd or metaphysically impossible, but it's just a logical impossibility. Such an impossibility has nothing to do with the fact of time consisting of instants, but it's simply because the situation is self-contradictory. Now, I should note here that you can avoid a straight-out contradiction by not making these statements here, not saying you cannot survive past 12. You could just simply set up the scenario and say, when is the person killed? Which avoids explicitly stating that they will be killed. But at that point, we simply say there's no answer to that question, right? Because at any point where the person would be killed, there's an earlier point. So there just is no point at which the person is killed. At the same time, it seems hard to understand how the person could survive because there's an infinite number of Reapers. That's just reflecting the fact that the situation describes an impossibility. We're basically asking the question, what is the smallest element in the set that has no smallest element? So the answer is, well, there isn't one. But the way that Craig states it, I think here is explicitly contradictory because he says you cannot survive past 12 p.m., which is equivalent to saying there is a smallest Reaper, which there isn't. Now, there is a modified form of the Grim Reaper argument that I found in the literature. I don't know if Craig himself appeals to this. I think I got this from Alexander Pruss. So he, I can't remember exactly why he presents this. I think it may have been to avoid some of these issues, or maybe it was something else. Here, there's an infinite number of Reapers, but now they appear in the interval at random. As there are infinitely many Reapers, for any Reaper appearing at time t, there will always be one appearing before that. But now they won't be described by this set of numbers here because they're appearing at random times. It follows that no individual Reaper could be the first to appear, and thus no individual Reaper could actually make, the reap that kills you. At the same time, it seems absurd to say that you could survive this situation since it only takes a single Reaper to kill you, and by assumption, there are infinitely many which appear during the interval. Unlike the previous version, there's no logical impossibility here because the set isn't defined in the same way. It's defined randomly, so you sort of can't. Well, I suppose you might be able to define the set if you defined exactly the random process for them appearing, but he doesn't really say that here. At any rate, I don't discuss that here. The question arises as to how to resolve this apparent contradiction. What makes the situation impossible? Craig seems to think that the only answer is that time cannot be infinitely divisible, which would entail that there was a first instant after 12 p.m. at which a first Reaper could appear. If time is not infinitely divisible, then this set becomes finite, and there will be a first Reaper, right? There's a first kind of point in time where the first Reaper can appear, but it's not time is not infinitely divisible, or does not consist of a predefined set of moments, I suppose would be a better way to put that. Sorry, I got lost here. Yeah, so that's what Craig says. However, it is not actually possible for the Reapers to randomize their arrival time. Oh, sorry. Let me say that again. Perhaps it is not possible for the Reapers to randomize their arrival times in this way. I mean, it's not really clear what the mechanism is supposed to be for them to do that. Alternatively, we can note that the Grim Reapers would have to be immaterial in order to act within an infinitesimal time span. So you couldn't have a material object doing that. So maybe we could use this argument to reject the possibility of immaterial persons. Overall, even this modified version has no clear implications, in my view, concerning whether time could be comprised of infinitesimal instants. Clearly, I think this describes an impossible situation, but I think that it's up to some interpretation as to exactly why this randomized version is impossible. I think that maybe you can give different analyses depending on exactly how you understand this randomization process in particular. But I don't think it's a good argument for the fact that time cannot be comprised of instants. And therefore, the relevance of this is that Craig is denying that time and space that the existence of temporal and spatial points can be used as a counter argument to his claim that there is no actual infinite. But I don't think Craig has shown that this is a compelling counter argument. The best case is this randomized version of the Grim Reapers, and there are so many other things that you could appeal to there. You could just say that there's no such thing as randomization of infinitely many objects, or you could say that there can't be immaterial Reapers or something like that. I don't think it follows that we should reject the possibility of spatiotemporal points, and therefore I think this still stands as a possible counter-argument to Craig's claim of no actual infinities. All right, now a last point here, which I've touched on, but we're going to discuss in more detail, is this issue of the infinite set of past events. Is that an actual infinite, right? Yeah, so this is what I was saying was the unsatisfiable pair diagnosis. Yeah, thanks for that. So I don't use that phrase, but that's what I'm talking about there. Now, Craig argues that if the universe had no beginning, then the past would be actually infinite. But that is hard to reconcile with his presentist philosophy of time, according to which the past does not exist. In particular, it seems that if Craig argues that the past cannot be actually infinite, then he must also say that the future cannot be infinite, which seems like an absurd conclusion, given that Craig thinks that, heaven will be infinite in duration, right? At least potentially infinite. Now, Craig has responded that the past is already completed, and so if there was no beginning, it would be an actual infinite, while the future has yet to come and therefore is only a potential infinite. Craig, however, believes that God knows everything that can be known, including the outcome of all future events. Since Craig believes that the future is potentially infinite, so it will go on forever without end, but it will never be infinitely long, it seems to follow that God must know an infinite number of things about the future. Now, Craig has countered by saying that God's knowledge is not propositional and thus cannot be divided into infinitely many discrete units. By the way, that's another counter that people have occasionally given, that, well, isn't God's knowledge infinite? But he says, well, his knowledge is non-propositional, so it doesn't count. However, this response doesn't really seem to matter, because it's not a question of how God's knowledge is differentiated into propositions. The question is, how many facts does God know about the future, whether or not they're in propositional form? Facts are not abstractions or mental events, but they're states of affairs that exist in the real world. So the question is, how many future facts does God know? Let's consider, for example, that if God exists, he must know how many praises Craig will sing on his first day in heaven, how many he will sing on his second day in heaven, and so on for infinitely many future days. So even if God knew nothing about the future, there still would be infinitely many future tense facts concerning events that will happen in the future. So he'll sing this many praises on day one, he will sing this many praises on day two, and so forth. That's what we mean by future tensed fact. Remember that Craig believes in a tense theory of time, so he believed there are tensed facts. So even though the future events have yet to occur, according to Craig's presentist philosophy of time, therefore future events don't exist, there will still be future tensed facts about events that will occur. Craig has said this before, right? He says that future tensed facts are still true, even if the future itself doesn't exist. There's still it's true now that so and so will happen in the future. So if the future is potentially infinite, there is now an infinite number of future tensed facts about the future. That doesn't require that the future exists. It just requires that now there are infinitely many future tensed facts. So Craig cannot say that these facts are merely about a potential infinite rather than an actual infinite, with the total number of future praises being indefinite, which is what he says. He says that there will be an indefinite number of praises, because that's just not true. There is now a future tensed fact concerning each praise that will eventually be said. This is easy to get in tangles with this, and I think that this is how Craig weasels out of this discussion, like he has in several discussions, I think, with Malpass about this issue. We're not the claim here is not that there are now infinitely many praises that Craig will sing. Obviously, Craig doesn't think that. He's a presentist. The claim is that it is now true that there are, or probably should say it this way, it is now the case that there are infinitely many future tensed facts about how many praises Craig will sing in heaven, if heaven is real and so forth. And therefore, it seems that the number of facts about the future is infinite. And that is irrelevant as to whether God knows that or not. That's the number of future tensed facts. Further, given that God is omniscient, God must know about each of these future praises in complete detail, and God's knowledge of what is yet to come cannot be indefinite. So if you asked how many praises will Craig sing in heaven in the future, the answer can't be indefinite, because that would be like asking God, how many praises will Craig sing in heaven? And God's like, well, it's indefinite. No, it's not indefinite. God could describe in excruciating detail precisely all of the individual praises that Craig will sing in heaven, because God's omniscient, right? So he knows all of these future tense facts, and clearly there's infinitely many of them. It's not indefinite, because that would be implying that God doesn't know them, but he obviously does if God is omniscient. But God must therefore currently know an actually infinite number of facts about an actual infinite number of future praises, an actually infinite number of future tensed facts about the future. Again, this does not require that future events exist, just that future tensed facts about them are currently pertain. And Craig, as far as I know, believes that, right? Because he thinks that we can talk about the past and the future just with past or future tensed facts. Morrison summarizes this point, quote, "For any n, praise number n will be said. There is a complete determinate fact of the matter about when it will be said, by whom and with what words, and in what precise manner. Nothing has been left indefinite or indeterminate. The correct answer to the question, how many praises will be said, can only be infinitely many. If there are truths about the future, then presentists, like Craig, cannot dodge questions about the number of events that will occur in scenarios like the ones I have proposed, I being Morrison here. If there is now a complete body of truth about an endless series of discrete and successive events, each of which will occur, presentists cannot avoid answering the question, how many will occur? The non-existence of past events does not prevent us from asking how many have occurred, nor should the non-existence of future events prevent us from asking how many will occur. In neither case will indefinitely many do as an answer, end quote. So in response to this line of criticism, here's what Craig has to say, quote, if the series of future praises go on forever, there will never be uttered an actually infinite number of praises. Rather, infinity serves merely as the limit which you endlessly approach, but you never arrive at. The number of praises is always finite, but it is always increasing toward infinity as a limit. You can't say that about the past. For the past to be potentially infinite, it would have to be finite but growing in the backward direction. That is to say, growing in the earlier than direction to be the mirror image of the future. And that is crazy. The past isn't growing backward in the earlier than direction. It is moving forward in the sense that with the present event, there should be a comma there, more and more events are being added to the past, end quote. However, Craig's remarks here simply miss the point, and I'll add that this is borne out with discussions he's had more recently with people like Malpass. When Craig says here, there will never be uttered an actually infinite number of praises, that isn't the point. That isn't the argument. Morrison doesn't say that. No one says that. The argument is not that there will one day have been uttered an infinite number of praises. There will never be a future day when infinitely many praises have been uttered. Rather, the argument is that it is now the case that there are infinitely many future tense facts about the number of praises that will be uttered in the future. That's not the same as saying there will be a day when there have been infinitely many praises. Craig is flipping here between the language that he's using to avoid answering the question. This is exactly analogous to how there would be infinitely many past tense facts about how many praises had already been said if the past was actually infinite. This is similar to the mistake Craig makes when he argues that, quote, an infinite temporal progress of events does not entail that an actually infinite number of future events will occur. There never will occur an actually infinite number of events, since it is impossible to count to infinity. The only sense in which there will be an infinite number of events is that the series of events will increase toward infinity as a limit, end quote. As I've said, it is true that every event in the future will occur in a finite amount of time from the present. As Craig says, it is impossible to count to infinity. We won't reach a point where there have been infinitely many events have occurred or infinitely many praises have occurred. However, that is in no way inconsistent with what Morrison is saying and what I'm saying and what Malpass and others have said, which is that there will be an actually infinite number of events that will occur in the future. This is equivalent to saying that while every natural number has a finite difference from any other natural number, so if you go from 0 to any natural number, the difference is finite, but there are infinitely many natural numbers. So I've got this in a figure here, which I'll just get to in a moment. No individual future event is infinitely distant from the present, such that from some future vantage point, we could look back and say, oh, since then, infinitely many events have occurred up till now. That will never happen. Nevertheless, it is also true that the number of future events is infinite. I mean, what else could it be, right? As Morrison says. Craig's attempts to defend this a portion of his argument continually fail to appreciate this distinction, or less charitably, he deliberately fails to appreciate this distinction. So here's a diagram here by which I hope that we can help to understand this. So imagine that we're starting at event 1 here and looking forward to the future, right? For each future event, from event 1 to 2 or 2 to 3 or 1 to n+1, there's always a finite time differential or a finite duration between those events. So there's no event at any point in the future where you'll look back and say an infinitely long interval has elapsed between this event and this event. So Craig is correct when he says there will never be a time at the future when we look back and say infinitely many praises have been sung. However, the total number of events in the future is Aleph naught. It's infinite. Those two claims are consistent and just requires you to think about exactly what is being said. And Craig always slips between people asking him, how many praises will you sing, to answering, I will never have sung infinitely many praises, when that wasn't the question. And this is very frustrating because people like Malpass and Morrison and me try to be very clear about what we're asking. And Craig is smart enough to understand this, but he seems to just refuse to answer this question. I think because he doesn't have an answer to the question. And the reason this is important, by the way, if you're wondering why do we care how many events are there in the future, Craig cares about the past. The reason is because if it is the case that it is impossible for there to be infinitely many events in the past, it should also be impossible for there to be infinitely many events in the future. And that won't work for Craig. Obviously, he cannot endorse that position because heaven heaven cannot be limited, right? I suppose he could say that maybe heaven will exist in a timeless state. You could get around it that way, but apparently he doesn't want to say that. So the number of future events cannot be infinite in the same way as the past. So what he has to do is draw a distinction between the set of past events and the set of future events. And he wants to say that the set of past events must be finite, but the set of future events doesn't have to be. The problem is that there just doesn't seem to be any way of making sense of this distinction, as I'll draw out further here. So he's been trying to avoid this conclusion that under his presentist philosophy, the set of future events also appears to be infinite in exactly the way that the set of past events would be if there was no beginning. But Craig is trying to avoid this, and the way he avoids it is just by not answering the question, as we've been saying, right? So the real trouble for Craig is in trying to establish a difference between the status of the past and the status of the future. Under presentism, both the past and the future are equivalent in that, remember, they don't exist. And so the analysis of the status of past tense facts must be the same as the analysis of future tense facts. Thus, either neither constitutes an example of an actual infinity, in which case Craig's argument that the past cannot be actually infinite fails because it's not an actual infinite, or they both constitute actual infinities, in which case the possibility of an actual infinite past is proven by the acknowledged possibility of an infinite future. Or in other words, if Craig accepts an infinite future, he must accept an infinite past. Or if he wants to deny an infinite past, he must deny an infinite future, which he doesn't want to do. So Craig's in a bind here, right? And remember, this is all coming about because Craig didn't know or think about the philosophy of time before he wrote the Kalam. I quote him earlier in the previous section on this. So now he's met all of these problems which are arising from this. He had to find a philosophy of time that fit with his intuitions and his arguments, and that's presentism, because under a tenseless theory of time, like a block universe theory, nothing begins to exist. The universe could just simply be finitely extended in the earlier than direction, and there's no beginning to exist in the way that Craig means. And so his arguments don't really apply to that. So he's got to have presentism to avoid that. Then he has to get around the problem of the extent of the present, remember, because he can't appeal to an infinitesimal present because then there would be actual infinity. So that argument goes out the window. And also, infinitesimal moments of time would mean that the time doesn't proceed in accordance with successive addition. So his second philosophical argument's out the window, and he has to rely on the scientific arguments, which, as we'll see later, completely fail. So he's forced by the logic of the argument that he's already written into presentism, and then from there into this ridiculous position of the extent of the present. But he has further damage control to do even beyond those, because now he has to make a distinction between the ontological status of the past and the ontological status of the future, even though under presentism, they are just both versions of non-reality. They both don't exist. And he has to find some way of distinguishing between them. Otherwise, he either can't argue that the past must be finite, or he has to argue that the future is going to be finite. So let's see what Craig has to say about this. Quote, "It is far from clear that the presentist is unable to draw a meaningful distinction between the actuality of the past and the potentiality of the future. Future events have not, as of yet, been actualized, whereas past and present events have been actualized." End quote. So Craig's grouping of the past and present in this way is highly misleading. For as a presentist, Craig argues that the past and the future are alike in not existing, while only the present exists. Here, he is unequivocal in stating, for example, that past entities do not exist. That's a quote from his book, The Tense Theory of Time. So remember, Craig says that past entities don't exist, while also saying that the reason the past has to be finite is because you cannot have an actual infinity. So how is it that an infinite past would mean an actual infinite, even though the past doesn't exist? Well, this is the problem that Craig has to face, right? He has to somehow make it that the past exists and doesn't exist at the same time, because he needs the past to exist in order for it to count as an actual infinite, in order for these arguments to work. But he needs it to not exist in order for presentism to work, which he needs for his philosophy of time to undergird the Kalam. You see the bind he's in. He can't make all these things work at the same time. Not just in my opinion, but in the opinion of a number of philosophers who've commented on this, and we'll keep going. So it is not correct to say that present events are like past events in that both have been actualized. Rather, according to Craig's view, past events have already been actualized and have gone out of existence. Present events have been actualized and now exist, and future events have yet to be actualized and have not come into existence. So when presented in this more accurate way, it remains unclear what exactly past and present events are supposed to have in common that distinguishes them from future events that makes them more actual. Yes, it's true that past events have been actualized, but they've also gone out of existence. And that's kind of the key point, right? That they don't exist. Under presentism, the past has gone out of existence, and so it's just as unreal as the future. Past and future under presentism are just different versions of unreality. Neither of them exist. So here's another attempt that Craig makes to draw a distinction between the past and the future. Quote, when we say that the number of past events is infinite, we mean that prior to today, Aleph naught events have elapsed. But when we say that the number of future events is infinite, we do not mean that Aleph naught events will elapse, for that is false, end quote. Now, this is just wrong. I just don't know how Craig can say this. It's just false. Under presentism, a future event is simply an event that has not yet elapsed. There's nothing else to being a future event. It just hasn't elapsed yet, hasn't happened yet. If events continue to occur without end into the future, clearly the number of events that has not yet elapsed, and therefore the number of events that will elapse, is Aleph naught. There are infinitely many of them. This is just the Morrison's point about the number of praises again. Craig says that there aren't Aleph naught events that will elapse, but he's just wrong. When pressed on this, he will say, there will never be a time when Aleph naught events have elapsed between now and then. But that's true, but that's not the claim. Remember, that's confusing the difference in time between two events and the size of this whole set of events. Yes, it's true that there will never be an event with an infinite time duration between now and that event. That isn't the question. The question is how many events will elapse in the future if there's no end to the future, right? And the answer is Aleph naught. That's the only possible answer. Craig appeals to the objectivity of temporal becoming here are simply irrelevant. The fact is that the number of events yet to elapse is infinitely large, the same as the number of events that would exist in an infinite past, if there was no beginning to the universe. There just isn't anything under a presentist philosophy of time that's growing in the direction of the future. Literally nothing grows into the future. The present is all that exists. The past and the future events do not exist. Nothing is growing in the way that Craig mentioned before. So if Craig describes past events as actual, he must likewise say that future events are also actual because those are supposed to be both alike. Craig's responses now, in my view, become very desperate. He claims that the series of events that have not yet happened, so that's future events, under a presentist theory in no sense exists. Okay, so if that's true, how can God know about each and every praise that will be uttered in the future? If there's no series of events that will occur, it seems there could not be anything in the future for God to know about. Yet clearly this is wrong, as even if there never will be a future time when infinitely many praises have been said, it is nevertheless the case that the number of future tense facts about future events that God knows about is actually infinite. That's the point I made before. There's nothing potential about this infinite. It is now true that God presently has knowledge of an actually infinite number of praises that will be said. So remember, under presentism, the future does not exist. So future events don't exist, but future tensed facts about the future do exist, or pertain if you prefer. And God knows them, right? If God exists and is omniscient, God knows them, all Aleph naught of them. There's no getting around that. And now what Craig says becomes very strange. Quote, the perfect tense of has happened covers every time up through the present, and so includes every event past and present. Everything that has happened has been actualized. We heard that before. Thus, the actual world includes both what does exist and what did exist. But events which have yet to take place, being pure potentialities, are on a tense view of time not part of the actual world. The ontological distinction between the past present on the one hand and the future on the other is especially perspicuous in the growing block views of time. Those views hold that the past and the present are real, the future is not, but the block of reality grows in the later than direction as more events are added to them. That's what he's referring to here. A proponent of the Kalam who accepts the growing block view has no difficulty in differentiating the actuality of the past from the potentiality of the future. My claim is that the tenseless existence of the past block of events is not a necessary condition of the past's actuality. Even if past events do not exist, they are still part of the actual world in a way that future events do not, since the actual world comprises everything that has happened, end quote. So I was just really baffled when I read this. This is in his, what's Ibid? I think that's his tensed or tenseless theory of time. Oh, no, I think this is actually a paper responding. Yeah, this is the problem with Ibid, right? Yeah, okay, so that's a more recent paper. Particularly this last part here. What Craig is trying to say is that past events don't exist, right? But he has to say that to stay a presentist, right? To fit with presentism. But they are part of the actual world, whereas future events don't exist and are not part of the actual world. This is essentially the clearest philosophical example of trying to eat your cake and have it too. Because Craig needs to say both that the past is, in some sense, more real or more actual than the future, but also that the past doesn't exist. So in order to do that, he comes up with this idea that past events, because they have elapsed, are part of the actual world, but future events, because they haven't elapsed, are not part of the actual world, even though past and future both don't exist. So this means that Craig is saying that there are, well, in fact, most events in the actual world don't exist. But there are types of events that exist but are in the actual world, that exist and are in the actual world, and that don't exist and are not in the actual world. So the past does not exist but is part of the actual world. The present exists and is part of the actual world, and the future neither exists nor is part of the actual world. You might wonder, well, you can say that, but what is the justification for this claim? Why say that it's actual but doesn't exist? Like, what does that mean? And what's the motivation for drawing this distinction? I think it's pretty clear, right? It's to save the Kalam. That's the only reason for thinking this. It seems that Craig is truly grasping at straws here. He needs the past to be unreal in order to be consistent with his presentism, but at the same time, he needs the past to be more real than the future in order for his argument against the possibility of an infinite past to succeed. Otherwise, again, it's going to say that the future can't be infinite, and that's not going to work for Craig. So faced with this dilemma, Craig is forced to endorse this absurd notion that past events can be part of the actual world despite not actually existing. Compare these remarks to what Craig says when defending presentism in a different context. So this is from his book, so it's from a different context. Quote, on a presentist ontology, past and future events, things, times are not real or existent, and hence do not exemplify properties like pastness or futurity. Hence, there can be no question of an entity's trading in futurity for presentness or cashing in presentness for pastness. Rather, entities come to be and pass away absolutely, so that the only temporal entities there are the present ones, end quote. It seems pretty clear from this quotation here that Craig is saying, look, there is no sense in which the past or future are real or exist. They don't have any properties. They don't exist, right? Events come into being and pass away out of existence, and that's all there is to it. Only events that exist are the present ones. But in this quote here, he's saying, well, the past events have been actualized, so they're still part of the actual world, even if they don't exist, without really explaining what the difference is between being actual and existing and actual and not existing. Now, I mentioned this to Malpass in one stream, and he noted that there are some, there is some discussion. You can't see my highlights. I just noted this. That's really weird. If I'm selecting text, you can't see what I've selected there. That's annoying. I didn't realize that. Anyway, that's sort of beside the point. Malpass mentioned to me that, and I sort of realized that this is the case, there is discussion in philosophy that does distinguish between things like the actual world, so in possible worlds theory, there's the notion of actual world. And depending on your view about the status of possible worlds, you might distinguish between worlds that exist but are not actual and worlds that exist and are actual. So if you're a modal realist, you think that all possible worlds exist, but one of them is the actual world, which is like our world. But other worlds exist but are not actual. So you could make sense of it that way using this particular philosophy. However, that carries a pretty heavy burden there about, modal realism in that case. Now, this is not exactly about possible worlds here. So perhaps Craig is trying to make some appeal analogous to the modal realism case, although I'm not exactly sure what the analogy is supposed to be, because it doesn't really do to say that the past exists but is not actual. That's actually the opposite of what he's saying. He's saying that it doesn't exist but is actual. So that's kind of the opposite of how this is used, at least to my understanding, in possible world semantics. So the point here is that perhaps Craig can salvage this somehow with some super sophisticated philosophizing to make sense of how something can be actual but not exist, simply in virtue of having elapsed, even when he says pretty clearly that past and future are not real or existent and do not exemplify properties. Maybe he could do that, but as far as I know, he hasn't even tried, and he doesn't explain it anywhere. This is just a get out of jail free card because he needs this problem to go away, and so he just sort of says some stuff here. That's my take on it, because I don't think it makes a lick of sense. And remember, we're supposed to buy these absurdities about moving people around in an infinite hotel. That absurdity is supposed to be enough to reject the existence of an actual infinite. But then we're supposed to buy the idea that past events don't exist but are actual. I mean, I just don't get it. I just don't get that. Anyway, back to the text. Here, there is no hint of any distinction in this quote between the existential status of past and future events, things, or times, and an unequivocal statement that neither exists or has properties. This is because when outlining and defending presentism as a philosophy of time, it's convenient for Craig to emphasize the unreality of past and future alike, because that's where the position is strongest. When defending the Kalam, however, such positions become inconvenient because there's this issue of trying to say that the past is actually infinite, but the future isn't. And thus, Craig attempts to escape with his self-imposed quandary here by arbitrarily asserting that non-existent past events are still somehow part of the actual world in a way that future events are not. Nor do Craig's appeals to the growing block theory of time help. The growing block would save him here, except that it's not presentism, and so it's not going to work. So Landon Hendrick notes this, quote, Craig could, I suppose, renounce presentism and start endorsing a view that he's previously said was incoherent. This is the growing block view. Otherwise, I can't see how the growing block theory is going to offer any comfort to Craig, who remains a presentist, end quote. There's simply no way out of this predicament, as far as I can see at least. Under Craig's presentist philosophy of time, past and future are placed squarely in the same category of non-existent things, or of times. Since Craig is firmly committed to presentism in order to establish the tense theory of time that he needs for the first premise of the extended Kalam, that's time is tensed, he is unable to defend the view that the past series of events constitutes an actual infinity. And of course, if the past series of events is not an actual infinity, then this whole issue that there cannot be an actual infinity is just irrelevant, because the finitude of the past doesn't hang on that, because it's not an actual infinity. It doesn't exist. I think this is one of the strongest objections to the philosophical arguments that Craig gives in favor of the finitude of the past. He just can't square it with his presentism, in my view. What's the way out of this? I think the way out of this is to simply give up the Kalam, at least as it stands, and endorse an alternate argument for the beginning of the universe. So maybe that's something like what Alexander Proust argues, for example, just to try to argue that the past, there cannot be an infinite succession of past events or something like that. Forget about all talk about actual infinities, and even don't worry about talking about the notion of time being tensed or tenseless or whatever. Just give that up as well. Just try to defend the idea that you cannot have like an infinite succession of events leading up to the present. That's kind of what Craig does in the second argument here, the impossibility of forming an infinite by successive addition, although he's still wedded to this idea of successive addition, which actually does raise some problems as well. But let's get into that now. So we've discussed his arguments that an actual infinite is impossible, Hilbert's Hotel and the subtraction of infinite quantities and such. Now we're going to talk about the impossibility of forming an actual infinite by successive addition. Okay, so the impossibility of forming an infinite by successive addition. So in addition to his argument that no actual infinite can exist in reality, Craig also presents a second independent argument for the finitude of the past. According to this argument, the past must be finite because the present has been reached, so we've arrived at the present, by the successive addition of each moment in time to the immediately preceding moment, which then added to the preceding moment before that, and so forth. Such a method of sequential addition, however, cannot ever give rise to an actually infinite series, for then the present could never actually be reached. As such, the temporal series of past events must be finite. So let's summarize the argument. Premise 1, it is impossible to form an actually infinite series by successive addition. Premise 2, the temporal series of past events is a collection formed by successive addition. Conclusion, the temporal series of past events cannot be actually infinite. So let's talk about counting to infinity. The most fundamental argument that Craig provides against the possibility of forming an actual infinite by successive addition is that however long you try to count or accumulate something, there will still always be an infinite amount left to go. So, for example, the difference between 1 and infinity is the same as the difference between any finite number and infinity. It's still infinite. As such, the amount remaining to count is never diminished. You never make any progress, so to speak. Another way of putting this is that every finite number is succeeded by another finite number, which is succeeded by another finite number. And so whenever you start from a finite beginning and add infinite increments, you always get a finite result. You never get any closer to infinity, and you never get to infinity. There's simply no way to turn a finite series into an infinite series by adding finite quantities to it. Now, this is true. It's completely true. You cannot form an infinite set through successive addition to a finite set. It doesn't make any sense. The problem with this argument is that all that it establishes is you can't turn a finite set into an infinite set by successive addition. Not that it is impossible for an infinite set to be formed through successive addition. Note the distinction there. It doesn't mean that you can't form an infinite set through successive addition. It means you can't form an infinite set through successive addition starting from a finite point. It's the starting point that's critical there. In Craig's examples, it seems that he implicitly assumes the existence of some sort of starting point, which is then removed an infinite distance into the past. Craig rejects the notion that he assumes an infinitely distant starting point. For example, he retorts that it is surprising that a number of critics, such as Mackey and Sobel, have objected that the argument illicitly presumes an infinitely distant starting point in the past and then pronounces it impossible to travel from that point to today. But in fact, no proponent of the Kalam argument of whom we are aware has assumed that there was an infinitely distant starting point in the past, end quote. Of course, just because you say that you're not assuming something doesn't mean that you're not assuming it. It may just mean that you don't admit to assuming it, which I think is the issue here. And as such, I think that Craig's examples do rely on an assumption of an infinitely distant starting point, which you then accumulate on, which, as I argue, and as everyone agrees, that doesn't make sense. So let's take a look at this example. Quote, given any finite number n plus 1 equals a finite number, hence Aleph naught has no immediate predecessor. And so you can't get to it from a finite starting point. Now, this is true, but that just establishes that you can't attain an infinite result by adding to a finite starting point. So this clearly has a starting point. So, I mean, this is not relevant to the question here because no one thinks that there was a finite starting point. There was time when there was a finite amount of time in the past, and then we added infinite time to that. That's not going to work. So this is irrelevant here because this assumes a starting point. Now, he also argues that the result holds even if infinite time was available to perform addition. So, quote, regardless of the time available, a potential infinite cannot be turned into an actual infinite by any amount of successive addition, since the result of every addition will always be finite. One sometimes, therefore, speaks of the impossibility of counting to infinity, for no matter how many numbers one counts, one can always count one number more before arriving at infinity, so you'll never get there. One sometimes speaks instead of the impossibility of traversing the infinite. The difficulty is the same. No matter how many steps one takes, the addition of one more step will not bring one to a point infinitely distant from the starting point, end quote. So again here, Craig speaks of adding and counting, and these operations starting point to act upon. Addition is only possible if we have a number that we are adding to, and that number in this instance must clearly be finite. If you started with an infinite set, well, then we've already got an infinity, and so there's no issue, right? The issue in question here, remember, is how do you get an infinite sequence of past events? If you start with an infinite sequence of past events and then add to that, well, that's not going to do because you've already got the infinite sequence, right? So Craig is saying you start with a finite set of events and then add to that and then somehow get an infinite set. Well, of course, that's not going to work, right? But Craig is trying to say here, I'm not assuming that there's any finite starting point, but the question is, how can you add without something to start from? You can't just add, right? It doesn't make sense. You have to add something to something else, and the something else has to be finite. Otherwise, we've already got an infinite, and there's no question to ask. So once again, all that Craig's example shows is that adding a finite number to another finite number will never yield an infinite number, and that is not in dispute. No one argues that. What Craig needs to show is not that adding two finite numbers always results in a finite answer, but that it is impossible for an actual infinite to form by successive addition. Even when he explicitly turns his attention to the question of whether it might be possible to form an actual infinity by never beginning but ending at a point, that is to say, ending at a point after having added one member after another from eternity. So this is the actual view that someone who thought the past could be infinite. This is the view that they would have, right? They would say that we never started from anywhere. We've just always been going, adding one event after the other from eternity past, right? So that's what the claim would be. Craig still just falsely assumes the existence of a starting point. So this is evident from his remark here, quote, if one cannot count to infinity, how can one count down from infinity? If one cannot traverse the infinite by moving in one direction, how can one traverse it by moving in the opposite direction? End quote. The problem here is that counting is an operation that requires a beginning. You can't just count. You always have to count from starting somewhere. Hence, Craig finds that in order to apply a counting analogy to the series of temporal events, he must use absurd phrases like counting down from infinity, as if infinity were a number that you could start counting from. As Craig says, infinity has no predecessor or successor. So it simply doesn't make any sense. It's impossible to count up or down from infinity. So this language here just doesn't make any sense. The problem has nothing to do with what direction we're counting in, whether it's up or down to or from infinity. The problem lies in Craig's insistence that he uses the language of counting when such terms only make sense if we start with something finite and add from that, or subtract from that, I suppose. In the case of forming an actual infinite by successive addition, not only is there no finite starting point, but there's no starting point at all. Counting analogies just don't work. So remember, the proponent of the infinite past is not going to say that we started with any amount of events and added to that. We didn't count up from 0 to reach infinity. We didn't count up from any number to reach infinity. Likewise, we didn't count down from infinity. None of these counting analogies matter at all. They all presuppose some starting point, which there isn't, right? The whole point is there is no starting point. One event has been succeeding another for infinitely long. There's an infinite number of these past events. There always has been an infinite number of these events. There is no start. And there is no process by which the present was accumulated from the past. It just endlessly, I should say, there is no process by which the infinite sequence of events was accumulated starting from anywhere. It just always has been infinite and keeps counting. That's what the proponent of an infinite past would say, something like that, right? They wouldn't say that we've counted up from infinity or down from infinity or counted up from a finite time. None of those make any sense. And all of the analogies Craig uses use counting language, and counting language always presupposes a starting point. You can't just count. You have to count from somewhere. But there is no from anywhere if the past is infinite. Always has been. This is what I say here. This is clearly not I should read this first. Craig's fundamental difficulty is that he insists on describing or conceptualizing the process of forming an actual infinite by successive addition as literally an accounting process, which must start somewhere and then count from that. But that's clearly not how infinite time could work. Craig's examples show that it couldn't work by starting somewhere and then getting to infinity after adding some number of events. That doesn't make any sense. A better way of describing how infinite time could work, assuming the past is infinite, is that there exists a process of continuous temporal becoming, continuous and eternal. Again, we're assuming tense theory of time here, just for the sake of argument. Each moment continues from the previous moment and inexorably gives way to the next moment in time, a state of affairs that always has been, that is, that this has been true at every past moment of time, of which there are infinitely many. At every past moment, there was a moment of time before that, and there was a moment of time before that. Time has always been passing, each moment giving way to the next for an infinite length of time into the past that has no beginning. There was no sense in which we accumulated the total the total duration of time from anything. It always has been infinite and always has been counting in the sense of moving forward. It's this conception of a beginningless past that Craig needs to defute, not the absurd notion that we somehow count from some starting point up to the present, as if we accumulate from a finite set. That just doesn't make sense. And so none of these accounting analogies can work. I'm tempted to skip this Zenoian section here, because I think it's kind of boring and I want to save a bit of time. So we're just going to skip that one. You can have a look at the book if you want to read that one. But I felt I should respond to it because he talked about it in a few different sections. So let's talk about coordinated events. Another argument that Craig presents against the possibility of forming an actual infinite by successive addition is his appeal to what he calls coordinated events. So he considers a situation where planets have been orbiting our sun for an infinite amount of time, with Saturn completing one orbit for every 2.5 orbits completed by Jupiter. So Saturn's orbiting slower than Jupiter in the sense of the number of orbits. So here's what Craig says, quote, "If they have been orbiting from eternity, which planet has completed the most orbits? The correct mathematical answer is that they have completed precisely the same number of orbits. But this seems absurd because the longer they revolve, the greater becomes the disparity between them, so that they progressively approach a limit at which Jupiter has fallen infinitely far behind Saturn. Yet, being now actually infinite, their respective completed orbits are somehow magically identical. Indeed, they will have attained infinity from eternity past. The number of completed orbits is always the same." End quote. As Craig correctly states, the number of orbits completed in this situation will be the same for both planets, infinitely many, and further, they will always have completed the same infinite number of orbits. Craig is clear elsewhere to emphasize that he is not arguing there's any logical contradiction here. His point is just that it's absurd that such a state of affairs could come about through an iterative process of temporal becoming, one moment giving way to the next. Now, my response here is just that I want to ask Craig why we should expect hypothetical processes that have been operating for an infinite period of time to accord with our intuitions about what seems reasonable or strange or whatever. The situation, as I see it, could be described as follows. The planets have both been orbiting the sun for an infinite amount of time, and their total number of orbits is the same, infinitely many. For every orbit they complete, there is always a previous orbit completed immediately prior to that, and at every orbit in their history, they have always already completed an infinite number of orbits. So there is no time when they had only completed a finite number of orbits. It's not like they start off equal and one gets ahead of the other. And this is the misleading graph that is actually shown in one of Craig's popular videos, where they start out having the same number of orbits, at least on the graph, and then they kind of diverge. they diverge, right? That doesn't make any sense. They've always completed an infinite number of orbits each, if the past is infinite. As noted previously, Craig admits there is no logical contradiction in this picture and argues based only on his own intuition that this state of affairs seems absurd. And of course, he's presented it in a rather stupid way by saying that they're magically identical. Well, they're not magically identical. It arises from the axioms of transfinite arithmetic, which we covered earlier, right? There's nothing magical there. That's just mathematics. Many others who have considered problems like this do not share the absurdity or do not see the absurdity. And even if they acknowledge the situation's, contrary to our normal experience of how coordinated events work, or a bit strange, nevertheless, our intuitions should not be expected to be reliable here when they're applied in cases far outside of our experiences, like infinitely long processes. So this appeal to absurdity is really the only argument that Craig can give here, and I just think it's an extremely weak one. So I don't think that provides a good argument to think that the past can't have formed by successive addition. Okay, now let's talk about the Tristram-Shandy paradox. And this is one of the ones that I found a bit harder to wrap my head around, at least. So I'll try to explain it in reasonably clear terms. Oh, all right, Tristram-Shandy. Tristram-Shandy is a hypothetical man who writes his autobiography so slowly that it takes him a whole year to write about a single day. Let's zoom in a little bit. Now, suppose Shandy never aged and never grew tired of his task, so he lived forever, and he could write for as long as he wished non-stop, so no bathroom breaks needed. That would be convenient if I could record my audiobook with no bathroom breaks or voice breaks, and I'd get it done quicker. But alas. Now, suppose now that he has been writing for eternity at this rate of 1 day per year of his life. On the basis of this thought experiment, here's what Craig argues, quote, if Tristram-Shandy had been writing for 1 year's time, then the most recent day he could have recorded is 1 year ago, because it takes him a year to write about a day. If he's been writing for 2 years, then that same day could not have been recorded by him. For since his intention is to record consecutive days of his life, so he's writing about all days, the most recent day he could have recorded is the day immediately after a day at least 2 years ago. So if he's been writing for 2 years, he can't have written anything about the last year because he's writing about the year before that, right? He's even further behind because it takes a year to record a day. Similarly, if he's been running for 3 years, then the most recent day recorded could not have been any more recent than 3 years ago, or 3 years plus 2 days ago, right? In other words, the longer he has written, the further behind he falls. The beginningless infinite series of days which he has recorded are days which lie at an infinite temporal distance from the present, end quote. Okay, so far so good, I think. Craig objects, however, that this is absurd because one cannot traverse. Sorry, let me say that again. Craig objects this is absurd because one cannot traverse an infinite distance in this way, as it is impossible for an event that was once present to recede an infinite temporal distance into the past. On this view, even if Shandy never began writing, nevertheless, the most recent day he could have recorded was once present and has now receded infinitely distant into the past. Now, Craig claims that cannot be since, quote, it is impossible to traverse the temporal interval from an infinitely distant event to the present, or more accurately, from an event that was once present to recede to a point that is infinitely temporally distant, end quote. So what Craig is saying here is that you can't have a situation where there was an event that was present and is now infinitely far in the past away from the present. Because basically that's like counting to infinity. He doesn't explicitly say that here, but that's essentially the idea. And the Tristram-Shandy paradox is an attempt to illustrate that. Obviously, it is not possible for a once present event to recede to an infinite temporal distance, as this would be equivalent to beginning at 0 and then counting up to infinity. We've just been talking about that. You can't count up to infinity. So an event that was present, or that is present, cannot recede in an infinite distance into the past. Craig is correct. That doesn't make sense. How then can we say that Shandy must be writing about events that occurred in the infinite past? Well, the answer, as Robin Small has shown, is that it is actually impossible to establish a correspondence between days to write about and years in which Shandy could have written about them, since for any given day he might be writing about, remember, we're assuming that Shandy here has lived forever, right? So there's a lot of days to write about. We realize that since Shandy is infinitely far behind, he cannot have gotten up to that day yet, and therefore must be writing about the previous day. I don't give the full derivation here. It's a little confusing, but when you sort of think about it, it kind of makes sense, right? There cannot actually be a day that he is currently writing about, because if you think, well, he's writing about this day, then you must realize, well, no, he's actually must be writing about the day before that, because he couldn't have got up to that day because he's so far behind. He must have got up to the day before that, but then he can't have gone up to that day because he must be writing about the day before that. So there's no actual way to write to establish a correspondence between years to write and days to write about. as long as you assume that Shandy can only write about days that are in the past, which I think is reasonable. He can't write about the future. So the way in which the Shandy paradox is specified, it makes it impossible for Shandy to have been writing for an infinite length of time. He could have been running for a finite amount of time, and so he's a large amount of time behind, but he can't actually be infinitely far behind in his journal if he writes like this, because you cannot establish this correspondence. Craig thinks that this means the past cannot be actually infinite, because there is nothing paradoxical about Shandy writing as slowly as he does. And again, we're assuming that if the past was infinite, then theoretically someone could live forever, right? And they could be writing a journal as slow as they wanted to. But Craig is mistaken here, because quite evidently, supposing that Shandy writes so slowly does lead to paradoxical outcomes if we also assume that he has been writing for indefinitely long. We just showed that it leads to a paradoxical outcome. You can't establish this correspondence, and yet we're just presupposing that he writes in this way, so it seems like he's writing about a day but not writing about a day. Doesn't really make sense. Oop. So just because the situation is non-paradoxical in the finite case doesn't mean that it doesn't follow that the infinite case is only paradoxical because infinities can't exist. We saw this before. You can't just say there's a paradox in an infinite case, therefore it must be because infinities can't exist. That's too hasty. Rather, it could be that just this particular situation or similar situations cannot be extrapolated into the infinite past. There is, in fact, a good reason to think this is so, since the paradox vanishes if we instead propose that Shandy takes only one day to write about a whole year. Because then it is possible to establish a correspondence between days to write about and days to write in and years to write about. So if he takes a day to write about a year, then he absolutely can have been writing from an infinite past. Because you can establish a correspondence there, because there's enough time to write everything. But if you flip it the other way and say he takes a whole year to write about one day, it turns out, and if you want the details, I recommend this post here from Robin Small, you cannot actually establish a correspondence between those. And so it actually is impossible for Tristram Shandy to have been writing in this way from an infinite past. Nor can Craig reply that if the past was infinite, then somebody could just start writing their autobiography this way, since then there would be a starting point to the writing, and that violates the key assumption that he's always been writing in this way. So you can't say, well, someone could just start writing like this, right? Well, no, they would have always been writing like this. But it turns out that that is logically contradictory. So this process cannot be extrapolated back into the indefinite past. And that's what I think this version of Shandy's paradox establishes. Certain classes of events cannot be extrapolated backwards indefinitely into an infinite past, such as this one, writing about your life 1 year to 1 day. It doesn't make sense. You can't draw out the correspondence. Other classes of events can be, like writing about your life 1 day to a year. That works fine, but not 1 year, not 1 year writing about 1 day. That cannot be extrapolated. It doesn't follow that we're justified in saying that no process of events can be extrapolated back into the infinite past. Only certain types of processes don't work back into an infinite past. So elsewhere, Craig considers a different version of the Shandy paradox. So instead of assuming that Shandy gets infinitely far behind and so never finishes his writing, Craig drops that assumption and then just imagines, suppose he finishes someday. Why then would he not finish writing yesterday or the day before that? Craig is arguing that this should be possible because he's had infinitely long to write, and therefore one can place the number of years he's been writing about in a one-to-one correspondence with the days he's had to write about them. So he should be able to finish by now, according to Craig. But if he finishes today, then why didn't he finish yesterday? Why didn't he finish the day before that? And so forth. Now, the problem here lies in Craig's assumption that Tristram Shandy will finish writing his autobiography if and only if the days he is writing about and the years he has to write about. So remember, he takes 1 year to write about 1 day. So Craig is assuming that he will finish if the years and days can be placed in a one-to-one correspondence. Even if such a correspondence existed, however, all that would show is that both sets are the same size. They're both infinite in size, right? Because he's lived infinitely long. He's been writing from infinity past, according to this assumption. Now, in order to answer the separate question of whether he will finish, we can't just simply look at the sizes of the sets. That would work for finite sets, but it doesn't work for infinite sets. And we keep seeing that come back again and again. The intuition works for finite sets, but it doesn't work for infinite sets. So in order to answer the question, when, if ever, will Shandy finish writing his autobiography, you can't just look at the cardinality of the sets of days and years. You have to look at the specific details of the situation. It's just like before when we said subtraction isn't defined in general for infinite sets, but the relative complement of one set in another is defined. So you just need to look at the specific situation in order to get an answer out. And it's likewise with this case here. Unless we permit Shandy, Am I inconsistent? Did I call him Sandy here? I called him Sandy here. Oh, shocking. Yeah, it's Shandy, not Sandy. If Shandy ever finished, sorry, what was I? Unless we permit Shandy to write about events that have not yet occurred, as I mentioned earlier, if Shandy ever finishes writing, then it cannot be the case that there is a one-to-one correspondence between days that he must write about and the years in which he was able to write about them. So that's what we were just saying before. This one-to-one correspondence doesn't work for an infinite past series of writing. So therefore, he can't finish if there is a one-to-one correspondence. And an infinite past. As Graham Oppy clearly explains, quote, given that Tristram Shandy takes a year to record a day, and he can only record a day after it happens, it follows, and without any considerations about how long he has been writing, whether from eternity past or not, that there is no year in which he could ever have recorded that day. Craig is just wrong when he claims that what Tristram Shandy's story tells us is that an actually infinite temporal regress is absurd, for the story is trivially inconsistent, end quote. And this is really the point here, right? The point is not that Craig says that, look, Tristram Shandy should be able to finish just as long as you can establish a one-to-one correspondence between the days and the years. But that's not true because the story is inconsistent. It doesn't make sense. You have to look at the specifics when it comes to infinite sets. There's just no way Shandy could ever finish because he always has to write about a year. He always has to write about a day in, let me rephrase that. It takes him a year to write about a day. But in that year's time, there's 365 more days. So it's impossible for him to ever finish, right? As long as you assume that he can only write about past events. So to say that Tristram Shandy writes in this way and yet finishes is trivially inconsistent. And that's what Oppy is saying here. Because it takes him more time to write about one day than the number of days in that time. So in other words, his work increases by 365 times each time he writes about a day. He can never possibly finish. Doesn't make any sense. It doesn't matter how long he's been writing. It's impossible for him to finish. So in this version of the paradox, where Craig is saying, look, suppose he finishes, it just doesn't make sense. It's inconsistent to say that Tristram Shandy writes in this way and finishes. It doesn't matter how long he's been writing. That's the issue here. Craig gratuitously assumes that just because you can establish a one-to-one correspondence between days and years, then therefore Shandy could finish. That's not true. In this, it depends on the details. And in this particular case, because of the way he's specified it, Tristram Shandy can never finish. It's trivially inconsistent to say that he could finish. As long as he can't write about the future. He could finish if he can write about the future, but we're assuming that he cannot. So here the situation's a little different from the example of the orbits completed by Jupiter and Saturn. Saturn will never be able to catch up to Jupiter because it orbits more slowly. Likewise, Tristram Shandy will never be able to catch up his journal because he writes more slowly than the events that he's trying to write. It's just really another example of coordinated events if you assume that he has to finish. Such situations are counterintuitive because the situations and experiences that shape our intuitions don't include examples of infinitely reoccurring events or events extrapolated to the infinite future, like the Tristram Shandy case as well. However, it doesn't follow that these situations are absurd or impossible. It just means that they're strange. And to extrapolate from these sorts of events to say that any type of successive addition process cannot be infinite into the past is gratuitous. There's no basis for that assumption. It's excessive. All we need to say to resolve the Tristram Shandy paradox is in the first case, notice that there cannot be a one-to-one correspondence established between days to write about and years to write about them in. And in the case where we assume that he actually finishes, and then in the second case, when Craig assumes that he finishes, just notice that it's trivially inconsistent for Shandy to finish regardless of how long he's been writing. So that version doesn't work either. So these scenarios are just logically inconsistent, however way you slice them. And they're logically inconsistent for reasons that don't apply to any version of an infinite event. That is, they only apply to certain versions of infinite events or certain types of processes. Cannot be extrapolated infinitely in the past. Doesn't mean that no process can. Craig hasn't established that. Okay, moving on from Tristram Shandy to finishing an infinitely long count. So Craig argues that arriving at the present moment after an infinite time in the past is analogous to a man who claims to have been counting down from negative infinity for eternity and just at this moment now reaches zero, which Craig thinks is impossible. So, quote, we could ask, why did he not finish counting yesterday or the day before that or the year before that? By then, he'd already had an infinite amount of time, so he should have had ample time to finish. Thus, at no point in the infinite past should we ever find the man finishing his countdown, for by that time, he should already be done. End quote. So this scenario, as Craig argues, shows that a situation where one never begins but reaches an end is impossible because you can't count down from infinity effectively to reach the present moment. But the problem here is that this is exactly the same problem as Craig's appeal to the Tristram-Shandy paradox. And I would add to his talk about the impossibility of counting to an infinity as well. It's really just the same thing. It's appealing to a logically contradictory notion that it's possible to count down from infinity. As I've said, counting is an operation that begins from some set, progressively adds or removes a certain number of elements from that set. In this case, we're talking about one at a time because it's like one event at a time. However, you can't perform that operation from an initial set that's infinitely large, since infinity has no predecessor or successor. So what the man who was counting would be doing is essentially he would be saying Aleph naught minus 1 is Aleph naught. Aleph naught minus 2 is Aleph naught. And he would never get anywhere because you can't count from Aleph naught. It doesn't make any sense. There's no sense of counting down from anywhere. And this is the same mistake we talked about before, that Craig insists of thinking about the process of temporal becoming in an infinite past as if we are counting down from something or accumulating up from some finite amount. But that's wrong. If the past is infinite and temporal becoming is real, the past set of events, or the number of past events, has always been infinite and has always been, the present moment's always been coming into and going out of existence. And that process never started. It never accumulated anywhere. It's never counted down from anything. It's just always been going for infinitely many events in the past. There's no contradiction there. So I think we can... so we'll just skip to this paragraph here, which I think is a good summary. Some of the confusion here may derive from a conflation between two claims. There is an infinite number of past events, and there is a past event infinitely removed from the present. The former does not imply the latter, just as the existence of infinitely many numbers does not imply the existence of an infinitely large number. And that's exactly the same as what this diagram here is showing. Now, this is talking about the future, but it applies just as much to the past. Imagine that we're here. So imagine this is the present, and we're looking backwards into the past. For every event in the past, that event is a finite distance away in the past from the present. So there is no time in the past from that time that has traversed an infinite amount of time to the present. Every past event is a finite distance in the past away from the present. So there's never a time that we traversed an infinite amount of time to get to the present. However, the total number of events is infinite. This is the same confusion that Craig was facing in the instance of thinking about the future. He was saying there never will have been an infinite number of praises he will sing. Yes, Craig, but there will be an infinite number of praises. Those two claims don't contradict each other because of the way infinities work, right? Likewise with the past. There is no past event that is infinitely far away in time from the present. And so we don't need to transverse an infinite amount of time. However, there are infinitely many past events. Those two claims are entirely consistent. That's just how infinities work. All right, moving on. One last point here. Is the temporal series of events formed by successive addition? So in this section, I've been responding to Craig's argument that it is impossible to form an actual infinite by successive addition. For this to even be relevant to the Kalam, however, it must be the case, as Craig says, that, quote, the temporal series of events is a collection formed by successive addition, end quote. However, this makes a pretty strong assumption about the nature of time. In particular, Craig assumes that time is not continuous, so that it grows forward from one instant to the next, like a sprouting plant without discrete steps, but is a continuous motion. Now, if this were the case, moments of time would not accumulate by a discrete process of addition, but by a continuous process of growth. This would entail either that time was comprised of an infinite number of infinitesimal points, or that it was comprised of a finite number of intervals existing independently and logically prior to the divisions that they're divided into. So that's what Craig thinks, right? As I argued previously, this latter possibility doesn't make any sense. It's incoherent. So if Craig is to argue that time is formed of discrete moments accumulated by a process of addition, he must first provide an argument as to why time could not grow continuously in the manner that I just mentioned. Now, he gave one argument against that, which is the Grim Reaper paradox, which we already talked about. But as I said, I think that just describes a logically impossible situation, unsatisfiable pair diagnosis. So I don't think Craig's given us sufficient reason as to why we should think that the past forms by successive addition. Why not think that the past sort of grows in a continuous manner? Then there's no successive addition, and none of these arguments even matter. Now, Craig tries to get around this by arguing that even if time does have the structure of real numbers, so this is another way of saying that time sort of grows, right? There's no immediate successor moment to the present moment in the way that 2 comes after 1. if you ask which real number comes after 1, there's no answer to that. There's no successor of 1 in the real numbers. So that's what it would mean for time to have the structure of the real numbers. It like grows continuously rather than increasing discretely. So even if that was true, then, quote, if we take, for example, the collection of past seconds in the history of the universe, such a collection has been formed by the successive addition of seconds, even if those seconds can themselves be divided into infinitely many subintervals, end quote. But this response can't be right, because if time increases continuously from one infinitesimal moment to the next, that's actually not a very good way to put that, because the whole point is that there is no infinitesimal moment, but maybe you get the gist I'm trying to say there. Then intervals of the length of 1 second are not added all at once, right? It's not like you have 1 second and then you add the next one. They grow until they reach completion and you've got the next second, and they keep growing in the next second. It's a continuous process. There's no successor to each moment. It just keeps growing continuously. Thus, between 1 second and the next, there has already been traversed an infinite succession of temporal instants. Indeed, if time does have the structure of the real numbers, then the number of instants in the interval of 1 second is actually the same as the number of instants from eternity past up to the present. So it is completely arbitrary for Craig to divide time up into equally sized events and then claim that there's an infinite number of these events, and therefore time forms by successive addition. If time grows in a continuous way, or has the structure of the real numbers, successive addition simply is not an appropriate way to think about the passage of events. And so Craig's analogy just doesn't work. Okay, so skipping that paragraph there, given all of these considerations here, I conclude that Craig does not adequately defend the premise that the temporal series of events is a collection formed by successive addition. Nor do I think he's established that even if it were formed by successive addition, then that would result in some sort of absurdity or impossibility. So that concludes the discussion of the impossibility of forming an infinite by successive addition, which was his second philosophical argument in favor of the finitude of the past. We are now going to consider the final argument. It's really a set of arguments, I suppose, for the finitude of the past that Craig gives, which is the empirical or the scientific evidence in favor of the finitude of the past. There is powerful empirical evidence for a beginning of the universe. Okay, so let's talk a bit about the Big Bang Theory. Craig argues that in addition to the philosophical arguments for the beginning of the universe, there is also powerful scientific evidence for an absolute beginning. To understand Craig's argument, initial background knowledge of cosmology. According to the Big Bang Theory, which has been the dominant theory in cosmology since the 60s, so it's pretty old now, the universe began to develop from a hot, dense point about 13.7 billion years ago, since which time it has been expanding and cooling. I guess 6,000 years ago if you're a creationist, although I don't think they believe in the Big Bang Theory either, so who'd have thunk it? The Big Bang Theory is supported by a wide range of empirical evidence, including the rate of expansion of the universe, the presence of the cosmological microwave background radiation, and the relative abundance of hydrogen and helium throughout the universe. Details of this are not really important for our purposes here. Let's just suffice it to say that the multiple lines of evidence have led to the theory being widely accepted as an accurate description of the development of our universe from a very early time. The Big Bang Theory itself, however, is not actually a theory of the origin of the universe. The theory does not make any claim as to what happened at the very beginning or at the moment of creation itself, but rather it describes the evolution of the universe from very early times. Technically, I suppose from arbitrarily early times, depending on how far back you trace the theory, but it doesn't say what happened at the initial beginning, the singularity, so-called. This limitation is a result of the fact that the current Big Bang Theory is based on the hypothesis that the universe has been expanding throughout its existence, and that's consistent with empirical evidence. Extrapolated back into the past, this leads to a state where all matter and energy in the entire universe were compressed into a single infinitesimally small point at a finite time in the past. However, at the very high energies and small distances that become relevant in the early universe, our current physical theories break down, or they're not applicable, would probably be a better way to say that. Specifically, the theory of quantum mechanics, which is applicable at very small scales, and the theory of general relativity, which is applicable at very high energies and masses, both simultaneously become applicable at these very, very early times of the universe. And this is a problem because these two physical theories, while they're both highly successful in these domains, are fundamentally incompatible. What this means is that we currently do not have a consistent way of using both of these theories at the same time. They require different assumptions, and they are not both. They cannot both be described. They cannot both be used to describe the same processes at the same time. In other words, we don't have a quantum theory of gravity. Various attempts to combine quantum mechanics and general relativity have been proposed, for example, the widely publicized string theories, but all face their own distinct problems and none are currently widely accepted. So we don't really have an established answer to this issue. So the current state of knowledge concerning the very early universe is limited by our inability to make any significant predictions about the behavior of the universe during its very earliest period of existence, when both quantum mechanics and general relativity are important for describing the development. So this is why the Big Bang theory does not, strictly speaking, provide a theory of the actual beginning of the universe, only its evolution from very early times. And we're talking fractions of a second there, but still that becomes important. Now, Craig is well aware of this limitation, and as such, he has developed his empirical argument for the beginning of the universe by appealing to various results which he claims showed that the universe as a whole had an absolute beginning, irrespective of what happened exactly at the moment of the Big Bang. Parenthetically, if you read some of Craig's oldest arguments defending the Kalam, he doesn't really draw this distinction between the Big Bang theory and the origin of the universe. He talks as if the Big Bang theory itself establishes an absolute beginning of the universe, which is not actually true. Now, he's been more careful in his more recent writings, but I just think this is interesting. Anyway, that is, Craig is primarily interested in appealing to not the Big Bang theory itself, but certain other results which he claims support his contention that the universe could not have existed for an infinite period of time. The basic approach here is as follows. First, Craig appeals to some particular cosmological theorem. He appeals to a particular cosmological theorem named after its originators as the Borde-Vilenkin-Guth theorem, or the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem. I think I've heard most of the combinations there. Craig argues that this theorem proves that under certain conditions, the universe must have had an absolute beginning, regardless of what occurred at the moment of the Big Bang per se. Second, Craig then considers the various assumptions that this theorem relies upon, and he successively argues that the various attempts to describe the early universe without those assumptions fail or still lead to a beginning. So basically he says, this theorem shows that there must be a beginning, except for these assumptions, but this assumption, you can't violate this assumption, you can't violate that assumption, or if you do, you still get a beginning. So that's the basic framework that he takes. He thus concludes that the Borde-Vilenkin-Guth theorem provides strong scientific support for his premise that the universe began to exist, in addition to and sort of standing alongside the philosophical arguments. Note that, and this is something that atheists sometimes say, which is really dumb, Craig does not argue that this theorem proves that God exists. He only says that it lends support for his premise that the universe began to exist, which is an argument for the existence of God. Okay, so let's talk about the Borde-Vilenkin-Guth theorem. Now, this theorem is very interesting because Craig says that it offers powerful support for his contention that the universe began to exist, whereas in fact it offers no support whatever for Craig's claim that the universe began to exist. And the reason for that is because of Craig's philosophical commitments, which we will see. We'll see how that works in a moment. So let's first talk about the theorem. I've made this point in a few videos before, but we'll cover it again here. So Craig argues that this theorem provides strong evidence that the universe, or even the multiverse, if there is a multiverse, had an absolute beginning. And in recent debates, this theorem has featured very prominently in Craig's presentation of the Kalam. You'll hear him appealing to this in most of his recent debates on this issue. So given its importance, it's useful to take some time to carefully think about what the theorem says. The original paper that presents the theorem is very short, and it's not actually that difficult. You just need some basic undergraduate level calculus to understand it. But here I'll do my best to explain it in simple terms. So let's take from the paper itself what the result proves. Quote, null and time-like geodesics are, in general, past incomplete in inflationary models, provided only that the averaged expansion condition holds along these past-directed geodesics, end quote. So that is literally what the theorem proves. Let us break that down and explain what this means. So let's define some of the jargon. A geodesic is simply the shortest line between 2 points on a curved surface. So it basically just means a line, but it could be on a curved surface. So a geodesic on like the surface of the Earth can look curved if you have a flat map of the Earth's surface and you draw a geodesic on it. It will often look curved, unless it's along the equator, because of the way that you've projected the spherical surface of the Earth on a flat surface. But a geodesic is actually just the shortest distance between those 2 points on whatever the curved surface is. So geodesics are important in cosmology because the general theory of relativity holds that light and matter follow geodesic paths, the shortest path, in a curved four-dimensional space-time. So I talked about that in the previous video, the idea of the block universe with 4 dimensions in general relativity, 3 of space and 1 of time, which kind of exist all alongside each other, combining space and time in 4-dimensional space-time, which fits very well with a tensor-less theory of time. Different types of objects follow different types of geodesics. So photons, so light, travels along what are called null geodesics because they travel at the speed of light. In addition to describing the paths that objects travel along, geodesics can also be used to describe the distance between 2 points in space-time. Loosely speaking, 2 events at different points in time are said to be separated by a time-like geodesic. So a time-like geodesic essentially represents the time distance between 2 events. It's not quite that simple, but that's pretty close for our purposes here. So a geodesic is said to be past incomplete if it is not infinitely long in the past direction. So past incomplete just means like finite in the past. So the statement time-like geodesics are past incomplete essentially means that the time interval between the present and any event in the past is always finite in these models, in this class of models. So that's what it's saying here. Null and time-like geodesics. So the one we're particularly interested in are time-like geodesics. So paths through space-time backwards into the past in general are finite. That's what this is saying here in inflationary models. So that means in models where the universe is expanding. The averaged expansion condition refers to the condition of the theorem, which states that it only applies when the universe is expanding on average throughout its entire existence. Now, this is generally thought to be the case in most modern cosmologies or inflationary models. However, there have been cosmologies developed that avoid this average expansion condition, which we would talk about. So let's go back to this quote here. So remember, the time-like part is the one we're interested in. So time-like geodesics basically means the distance between 2 events going backwards into the past, past incomplete, is finite, so past incomplete. So the duration between now and any event in the past going along any trajectory through 4D space-time must be finite if the universe has been expanding on average throughout its existence. So it could be, there actually could be periods of contraction, but as long as on average it's been expanding. So that's what this theorem says. So you can see how that kind of sounds a lot like saying that the universe is finite into the past. If every trajectory into the past terminates somewhere, well, then there's no path you can get that allows you to sort of go forever. And so the past must be finite. So that's the idea. Now let's dig into that in a bit more detail. So to summarize, this theorem states that tracing every time path in the universe back into the past, whatever the trajectory is, as long as it's directed into the past and it's a time-like trajectory, must always eventually terminate at some beginning with no infinitely long time paths possible. So here's a diagrammatic rough representation of this. Here's time and here's distance, right? So the universe is expanding over time. So we start at like a very small universe at the beginning. It expands over time, so it gets bigger. These various time-like paths, you can imagine starting at like the present here. Let's say that we're up here. You can trace them backwards along their trajectories, and they can go in different trajectories through 4-dimensional space-time. I'm only showing one dimension of space here, but you get the point. The point is they all terminate, right? None of them go on forever. They're all past directed, so they're sort of directed in the past here. They move backwards in time. Well, you can trace them backwards through time, so to speak, but they all terminate. And the theorem says that this is true for every time-like path in a universe that's expanding on average throughout its existence. As such, there is no possible way for an expanding universe or even a multiverse to be infinitely old in the past. All right, so that's what the theorem says. Now, that might sound like that supports Craig's contention, but let's see why it doesn't. So on the relevance of this theorem, this is what Craig says, quote, the Born-Guth-Vilenkin theorem proves that classical space-time under a single very general condition, which is about the expansion, cannot be extended to past infinity, but must reach a boundary at some time in the finite past. Now, either there was something on the other side of that boundary or not. If not, then that boundary is just the beginning of the universe. If there was something on the other side, then it will be a region described by the yet-to-be-discovered theory of quantum gravity. In that case, Vilenkin says that will be the beginning of the universe. Either way, the universe began to exist. Now, what Craig does not seem to realize is that his own metaphysical commitments preclude him from using the fact that time-like geodesics are past incomplete, that's what the theorem proves, to infer that the universe had an absolute beginning at a finite time in the past. That's what he wants to show. These two statements are not equivalent. The first refers to a space-time interval, time-like space-time interval specifically, and the second refers to a period of duration of metaphysical time. That's clearly what Craig is referring to when he talks about the beginning of the universe, and he points that out many times, particularly when we talked in the previous video about his philosophy of time. He's talking about metaphysical time. So in order for Craig's desired conclusion to follow, what Craig needs to assume is that space-time intervals described in the theorem are in fact the same thing as metaphysical time he talks about, or at least that the finitude of past-directed time-like space-time intervals implies the finitude of metaphysical time. That's what Craig needs to assume in order for his inference about the finitude of the past to follow from this theorem. That's what I just said here. Now, this position that there is a close connection between metaphysical and physical time stands in stark contrast with Craig's remarks about the philosophy of time in his other published works. Craig has repeatedly and emphatically emphasized the importance of distinguishing the concept of time in physics, physical time, especially in relativity theory, from the conception of time he appeals to in his philosophical arguments, metaphysical time. So he emphasizes the difference between, quote, physical time and space, clock and rod measurements, and metaphysical time and space, ontological time and space independent of physical measures thereof, end quote. That's in his book about Craig, Time and the Metaphysics of Relativity. Oh, yeah, sorry. He's Craig. That's in his book, Time and the Metaphysics of Relativity. In particular, Craig argues that one should, quote, distinguish metaphysical time from physical or rod time, physical or clock time, and maintain that while the former is tensed in nature, the latter is a bare abstraction therefrom, useful for scientific purposes and quite possibly tense less in nature, the element of becoming having been abstracted out, end quote. Craig is very skeptical about the relevance of findings from physical time to philosophy, stating that, quote, special relativity is a theory about physical time and space and says nothing about the nature of metaphysical time and space, end quote. And yet another quote, we must not forget that relativity theory concerns physical space and time only, not metaphysical time, end quote. This seems to present Craig with a major problem. If relativity theory presents physical time only, if relativity theory describes physical time only and says nothing about metaphysical time, then how can Craig infer that past metaphysical time is finite from the result about the finitude of past physical time? Indeed, Craig explicitly acknowledges that a beginning in one type of time does not imply a beginning in the other type of time. Quote, if we draw a distinction between metaphysical time and physical time as Newton did, it is quite evident that a beginning of the latter does not imply a beginning of the former. God in metaphysical time could be quite active prior to creation and could bring physical space and time into being after having existed without their being coexistent with him, end quote. So in discussing the various notions of time used in different fields of physical theory, such as thermodynamics, special relativity, and general, Craig notes that the many differences in properties these notions of time have from one another, and also from time as used in natural everyday language, and as a result, he concludes, quote, it is difficult to resist the conclusion that all of these operationally defined times are not really time at all, but just various measures of time suitable for their respective fields of inquiry, end quote. In regard to the space-time manifold that is the subject of both special and general relativity, and that's exactly what's being described in terms of these time-like paths, this space-time manifold, here's what Craig has to say, quote, Minkowski's four-dimensional mathematical space serves as a convenient calculational and diagrammatical aid, but says absolutely nothing about ontology. The four-dimensional continuum should therefore be regarded as a useful tool and not as physical reality. Minkowski spacetime is at best a representation of physical time and space as described by the equations of special relativity and cannot pretend to imply a four-dimensional ontology, end quote. So I've just presented you with a litany of quotes there where Craig very explicitly and clearly says that there's a difference between metaphysical and physical time, that physical theories only tell us about physical time, and that the fact that one type of time is finite doesn't imply that the other one is, and that we can't read our ontology or we can't infer anything about metaphysical time off of physical time. He's abundantly clear about that in his writings about philosophy of time. Now, all this raises the question as to what metaphysical significance Craig can place on the Born-Guth-Vilenkin theorem. It seems impossible for Craig to appeal to this theorem as establishing anything of significance about the origin of the universe or the finitude of time if he believes, as he said, that physical time is distinct from metaphysical time. At the very most, all the theorem shows is that one measure of physical time used in this particular theory of general relativity, which Craig thinks should be interpreted instrumentally anyway, must have a beginning. To infer from this that the universe must have actually had an absolute beginning in metaphysical time is simply impossible given Craig's views about time. Craig's inconsistent attitude about the philosophical implications of physical theories has been noted by Dorato, not sure how to pronounce that, I'm afraid, who in a review of Craig's book, Time and the Metaphysics of Relativity, a supremely boring book, by the way, states that, quote, Craig seems to oscillate between two contrasting philosophical positions. According to the first, relativity physics is not necessarily saying anything that is relevant for the metaphysician, a claim that tends to be advanced whenever evidence from physics is against his metaphysical views. The second position is that metaphysics confirms certain metaphysical and theological views over others, a fact that is put forth whenever evidence for the existence of a privileged frame, coming for instance from cosmological time or quantum non-locality, seems more reassuring. If this impression is well formed, which it is, Craig's book is essentially guided by an apologetic attempt and opportunistically uses physics and metaphysics for his purpose, end quote. So I'm not the only person to have made this point, that Craig is opportunistically using these otiose and difficult philosophical and scientific appeals to try to ground his apologetic enterprise. And that's one of the reasons, I think, why he basically never talks about this philosophy of time stuff or interpretation of relativity in his popular debates, because it's just really inconvenient for him. And it shows that the whole foundation of his argument, of all of his arguments for the Kalam, it is grounded on nothing. He cannot simultaneously say that scientific results don't tell us anything about metaphysical time, and also say that scientific results do tell us a lot about the metaphysics of time. It doesn't fit, but yet he literally has said both of those things in different contexts, whatever suits him at the moment. The problem goes beyond the issue of interpreting physical time and its role in scientific theories, because the way time is treated in the Borde-Vilenkin-Guth theorem is totally at odds with Craig's views about the nature of time. In the paper, time is treated as a continuous variable that you can integrate over. Basically, that means like sum up over. This makes no sense at all under Craig's presentism, since he does not believe that time has the structure of real numbers, so integration's out the window, nor does he believe that different moments of time coexist in a way that would make sense to like sum up or integrate over them. Craig believes that time consists of a series of non-metrical intervals of present, one constantly replacing the other as the objective temporal progression of time passes on, as per the tensed notion of objective becoming. Given this understanding, it's just absurd to integrate over a time like geodesic to produce a result for a maximum possible length of a proper time interval. Such a result is metaphysically meaningless, given that time is not continuous and consists of non-metrical present moments. Such a result might have some instrumental value, as Craig has said, but given Craig's commitments, it is ontologically totally confused and uninterpretable. Given Craig's own arguments, the Borde-Vilenkin-Guth theorem is absolutely worthless in establishing the absolute ontological beginning of the universe. In response to Graham Oppy, who raises the possibility of some sort of mathematical describable metaphysical time existing prior to the beginning of physical time, here's what Craig says, quote, I must confess I have no idea at all what Oppy is talking about. Such a purely mathematical extension is physically impossible, so that the entities of that time prior are presumably abstract objects which cannot by their very nature stand in causal series. In any case, Oppy's postulation of a prior regime of temporally ordered contingent causes is an exercise in metaphysics, and to advert to metaphysics at this point just is to admit that the scientific evidence supports the absolute beginning of the universe. End quote. Now, this response is pretty inadequate, because what Oppy is talking about here is exactly the same as what Craig himself has spoken at length and in the passages I quoted above, namely that what science has to say about physical time does not have any direct bearing on metaphysical time, and that the beginning of one need not imply the beginning of the other. Oppy is just saying the same thing that Craig has said many times, but now when that's inconvenient, Craig claims to have no idea what Oppy's talking about. To advert to metaphysics, as Craig says it, is not to admit that the scientific evidence supports an absolute beginning of the universe, but simply to agree with Craig in his assertion that scientific findings have no necessary bearing on the beginning of metaphysical time. Now, there should be an of there. But this is a really inadequate response here that he makes to, I think, one of Oppy's, that's arguing about gods, where Oppy talks about this issue. So just to clarify that, Oppy is saying that there could be metaphysical time that exists prior to the beginning of physical time. So therefore, this fact does not imply that there's no time. There just could be some sort of metaphysical time that exists before that. Craig says, no, that doesn't make any sense. Sorry, wrong passage. Craig says that doesn't make any sense because he has no idea what he's talking about, and they'd be just abstract objects. That's just bollocks, Craig. It's bollocks because you've said many times yourself that exact same point. And now somehow when it's inconvenient, you're just going to pretend to not know what Oppy talks about. Absolutely ridiculous. All right. Next section. Let's talk about closed time-like curves. And in fact, actually, I've just decided that I don't want to talk about that because it's a small section that's not that important anyway. So you can see the book if you want that. Now, here we will talk about this section, quantum cosmology. Okay, so In addition to its explicit assumption of a universe that's on average expanding, which we talked about that assumption, the Bordelein-Guth theorem also depends on its ability to describe the universe in terms of a curved space-time manifold, where we can define geodesics and other concepts rigorously. But as noted, the validity of this approach breaks down at very small scales and very high energies at the very early times of the very early periods in the universe's existence, where quantum mechanics becomes important. As Sean Carroll explains, this means that the theorem in effect states that the part of the universe we can describe classically, in this case meaning non-quantum, because it's still relativistically, the part of the universe that we can describe without needing quantum mechanics is past incomplete. It still remains possible that a beginning could be circumvented by some model of the universe incorporating the effects of quantum mechanics. And this is what Craig said earlier when he was saying that either there's something on the other side of that boundary or there isn't, right? So that's what he says here. Either there was something on the other side of that boundary or not. So he's saying that he agrees that that boundary, this termination here of the longest past directed time-like path, that's not necessarily the beginning of the universe. It's just that it shows that the classical part of the universe must be finite in the past. And then, well, what happened before that? So that leads us to talking about quantum cosmology. So Vilenkin and Hawking have both proposed quantum models in which the universe is postulated to have come into being as a result of quantum fluctuations. Craig argues that such models cannot avoid an ultimate beginning because, quote, the initial metastable state can only have had a finite lifetime, end quote. A metastable state is one that is stable temporarily, but then like an ornament that's perched precarious on a high shelf, it eventually falls off or like decays into a lower, more stable energy state. So Craig's argument here is that unstable quantum states always have a finite lifetime because any non-zero probability of fluctuation occurring would mean that the initial metastable state would only have a finite lifetime. As such, even if the universe did form as a result of some quantum fluctuation, the metastable state cannot have existed for an infinite period of time, and so the universe would still be finite. There was an unstable state before, like the Big Bang or whatever, began the universe, but whatever that metastable state itself was finite. So that's his argument. So one problem with this response is that the concept of classical time is not well defined in quantum scenarios. And as Vilenkin says, quote, we do not know what the right questions are, end quote, when he's talking about sort of defining the beginning of the universe in this context. So it's not even really clear how to operationalize time outside of a situation where we can apply notions of like geodesics and so forth. So it's premature of Craig to say that quantum states must have a finite lifetime, since we don't even have a clear definition of what a lifetime would mean, outside of a universe like this. A second problem is that Craig's argument is that it is theoretically possible for a randomly decaying metastable state to have an infinite lifetime. Yeah, that should be infinite. I don't know why it says finite. It is theoretically possible for a randomly decaying metastable state to have an infinite lifetime. Consider, for example, the normal distribution with its characteristic bell curve shape. So like this. Lost where we were. Yeah, if we regard the horizontal axis as representing time, as we said, it's a little hard to know how to define that, but let's just put that to the side for the moment. The probability of an event occurring between negative infinity and 0 is equal to exactly half, so 50%. Strictly speaking, an event is only guaranteed to occur after an infinitely long interval if its probability of occurring over that interval is constant with respect to the time parameter, as occurs for a uniform distribution. So in other words, if there's a constant probability of a metastable state decaying, as shown here, then yes, it will have occurred with probability 1 before, t equals 0. However, if the probability is not constant with respect to time, like shown here, the probability, this is a normal distribution, so the probability of it happening before this t equals 0 is actually only 50%. So it is actually possible with non-constant decay probabilities like this to have a situation where you have a metastable state that lasts forever, or an infinite amount of time, and then decays. It is at least mathematically describable. Now, when I wrote this section here, this was just a hypothetical that I thought about because remember, we're just talking about hypotheticals here. It doesn't actually have to be a real model. Craig's making a metaphysical argument, so I can give a metaphysical objection. Since then, I've actually discovered a few papers that have talked about this. This idea is sometimes called the emergent universe, where there could have been a metastable quantum state of some sort, which then decayed and then triggered a Big Bang in some way. And there are actually papers that have investigated models like this. It's not exactly a normal distribution, but there are ways to construct that are at least theoretically possible. We don't know if it's correct, but there are at least models that exist that have been published that present these sorts of scenarios where you can have a metastable quantum state that has an infinite lifetime and yet still decays. So Craig is just wrong when he says this is impossible. It is possible as long as you have a non-constant decay probability. Now, how plausible is that, physically? We don't really know. It's unclear. We don't have a quantum theory of gravity, right? So I'm just content to withhold judgment here. But Craig's the one who wants to draw metaphysical conclusions from premature science here. And so what I'm going to say is, well, no, actually, it is plausible. It is possible, and as far as we know, plausible, really, that there could have been an infinitely long-lived metastable state. So he's just wrong here when he says that the initial metastable state could have only had a finite lifetime. Yeah, so now this time variable probability is a bit unusual. You have to kind of set up the scenario for that to work, right? But I don't think that that's important here, because Craig is saying that the universe must have had an absolute beginning, and so it's incumbent on him to show that the other possibilities are ruled out. Because we don't really have much of an idea about the physics that govern the very early period of the universe, there's very substantial dispute among quantum cosmologists about this point. I think Craig is grossly premature in making the claim that a quantum fluctuation from a metastable state could not, in principle, explain the origin of the universe. Yeah, that's not very well worded. The point is that it could, it's not about whether it explains the origin of the universe. That's the next section. I should have reworded that better. The point is that Craig is premature in saying that there could not have been an infinitely long-lived metastable state which then gave rise to the universe. That's the point there. Now, Craig may instead argue that such a quantum fluctuation could occur, perhaps, but given how unusual it is and the lack of a precedent, it's not a very good explanation for the beginning of the universe. Now, that's only going to be a good objection if Craig can provide a more plausible explanation for the beginning of the universe that does not appeal to any unusual or unprecedented mechanisms. Now, as I argue in a later discussion, which we'll get to hopefully in the next video, Craig does not have any such proposal on offer. What he does is appeal to an immaterial mind and agent causation, both of which are completely alien to modern scientific theory. You cannot even start to describe them using any scientific model, and they're far more unusual and unprecedented than even my quantum fluctuation example or the scientific models of an emergent universe that have been proposed. So this appeal to a better explanation just isn't going to work here unless Craig actually does have a better explanation. The fact that maybe this is a bit strange or, the models are uncertain, well, that doesn't really matter because Craig doesn't have anything better to offer, and certainly he can't argue that that's impossible because it's not impossible. Now, let's move to the final scientific argument that Craig gives in favor of the finitude of the past. And this is different from what we've been talking about. It's not really about the Big Bang as such. This is about the second law of thermodynamics. In addition to the cosmological evidence for the beginning of the universe, Craig also argues that the second law of physics provides strong evidence that the universe began to exist a finite time in the past. To understand the argument, we need to understand the concept of entropy. In physics, entropy is a measure of the number of microscopic states that a given macroscopic system can be arranged in, and is often loosely described as a measure of the disorder of a system. So, for instance, there are a vast number of different ways in which the gas molecules in the air in this room here could be arranged so as to fill evenly the space of my room here. I say my study. I don't actually have a study. It's my bedroom, right? But you get the idea. And thus the macroscopic state of the air in my study is evenly dispersed throughout the room has a high entropy because there's lots of ways you could arrange the individual particles that would be consistent with that macroscopic state. By contrast, there are far fewer ways in which all the air molecules could be crowded together in one corner. I mean, there's still a bunch of ways you could do that, but many, many fewer. And you can actually calculate, we did this back in like second year physics, you can calculate the number of different microstates those two macrostates have. And it's vastly, vastly different, even for a relatively small room. So as such, the macroscopic state of all the air in my study is bunched into just one corner of the room. That has a very low entropy. The second law of thermodynamics is a key principle of physics, and it states that in a closed system, so that's one with no external energy input or outflow, entropy always increases over time. Now, the universe is usually thought of to be a closed system. So there's no energy input outside the universe. It follows that entropy should increase over time in the universe as a whole. As such, Craig argues that an infinitely old universe should feature maximally high levels of entropy, such that the universe will now be in a, quote, cold, dark, dilute, lifeless state, end quote. That is, if entropy increases over time and the universe has been around for an infinitely long amount of time, there should be no further possible ways in which entropy could still be increased, because every possible event that could increase entropy would already have happened, according to this argument. However, we don't observe the universe to look like this. It's clearly not in a maximum entropy state, since we still observe many processes of entropy reduction going on, like the formation of stars, gravitational collapse of clusters, chemical reactions, and so forth. And Craig therefore concludes that because entropy isn't maximum, the universe can't be infinitely old, and so the universe must have had an absolute beginning, a finite time in the past. So there are two major objections to this argument. The first is that it's clear that the observable universe is not in a maximal entropy state. That much is very clear from all the processes that we observe occurring in it. However, as mentioned above, not as mentioned above, however, it does not follow that the universe as a whole, the totality of physical existence, which remember was originally how Craig defined the universe, it does not follow that that cannot be in a maximal entropy state. Our observable universe could be part of a spontaneous fluctuation away from an overall equilibrium maximum entropy state of like some multiverse. So we could be a fluctuation of low entropy in an overall zero entropy multiverse. This general possibility has been considered by a number of cosmologists and is the subject of ongoing research. We don't really know. Craig has argued that various particular models to explain how this fluctuation could come about face problems. He devotes many pages of this to some of his more recent works, which I don't get into here, but it's really irrelevant, right? It doesn't matter if we can establish a scientific model of how this process could occur. All that matters is that metaphysically we can describe the possibility, and as far as you know, it isn't ruled out, or even especially implausible, right? Craig is making a philosophical argument. He's appealing to scientific evidence in defense of that, sure, but that doesn't mean that the opponent of his argument needs to provide a scientific model to refute Craig's claim. All they need to do is appeal to other scientific premises or findings in defense of their philosophical arguments. And the argument is simply that as far as we know, the universe as a whole, the totality of existence could be in a maximal entropy state. That is consistent with our current observations. We don't actually know one way or the other. And so Craig's appealing to the idea that we must be in a maximal entropy state if the universe had been infinitely old, but it can't be infinitely old because we're not. It just doesn't work, because as far as you know, we could be in a maximal entropy state. It's just that we're in a pocket that is in a low entropy state of the whole. We don't need to have a specific model of that in order for that to work as a counter argument to Craig. And that's something that Craig often does, is he applies inconsistent standards. He shifts the goalposts and moves the burden of proof. So when he's making an argument, it's a philosophical argument that appeals to scientific premises, but it's not a scientific model. When someone counters or provides a counter or critiques his argument, all of a sudden they have to provide a full scientific model of how that would work. Otherwise, it can be rejected. But that's absurd, right? If Craig doesn't have to provide a scientific model, I don't have to provide a scientific model. All I have to do is appeal to the results of science in defense of a philosophical argument, and that's all I'm doing here. Now, Craig might respond that the probability of our observable universe having begun as a random fluctuation from a pre-existing maximal entropy universe is so low that this would be effectively impossible. Undoubtedly, it is true that the initial entropy of the very early universe was so low that it would be effectively impossible for events like that to occur within our observable universe, because it would be the initial entropy of the observable universe was so low that would just, well, it's very unlikely that could happen by chance. Let me put it that way. However, to determine how likely it would be for that to occur in the universe as a whole, so not the observable universe, but the whole multiverse, if there is one, we would need to know the size of the whole multiverse, or the entire universe. We know the size of the observable universe. We have no idea how large the whole universe is. It may well be infinite in size. I guess Craig wouldn't like that, but as far as the scientific evidence is concerned, it could well be infinite in size. As such, we simply do not know how often such fluctuations would occur in the universe as a whole. We cannot calculate the probability of certain fluctuations occurring. Now, you can do that under certain models, and cosmologists do this, but all of those require certain assumptions. The answer is here, we just don't know. If the universe is big enough, then even extremely unlikely fluctuations could occur, and that could be what our universe is. Now, there's a more technical there is a more technical problem with this response from Craig relating to an assumption in entropy probability calculations that all microstates are equally probable. Now, we usually apply this assumption within our observable universe, but there's actually no way to tell if this assumption is true to sort of the whole of the multiverse. And so this is a discussion that's been had in some of the technical literature on this point about, are all microstates equally probable? But as a result of these sorts of considerations, I conclude that we just don't have a strong reason for thinking that the low entropy state of the observable universe is definitely a sign that the universe is finite in the past. Really, how and why the universe had such low entropy is just an open question in cosmology. Craig arguing that it shows that the universe must have been finite in the past, or is overwhelmingly likely to have been finite in the past, just isn't the case, because there are so many things that we don't have answers to, such as the possible existence of a multiverse of which we're a fluctuation away from. Then there's also this issue about whether all microstates are equally probable. Now, I thought I mentioned this here, but apparently I didn't. So there is another issue which plagues this argument from appealing to the second law of thermodynamics, and that is we don't know if there is even a maximal entropy state. It could be that there's always a higher and higher entropy state that's reachable, and so however high the entropy reached, there was always a higher state. So that's another issue, that it's actually possible that the entropy of the multiverse as a whole has been increasing from like forever, and will continue to increase forever if there's no maximal entropy state overall. That's another possibility that Craig really can't rule out. Yeah, I think I'm just going to skip that one here. So that concludes the discussion of the final argument that Craig makes, or set of arguments for the finitude of the past, namely the scientific arguments for the beginning of the universe. So that therefore also concludes the discussion of premise 2, the universe began to exist. Let me provide a brief summary. So in this premise, Craig attempts to establish that the universe began to exist by establishing that the universe is finite in the past. He provides 3 types of arguments in favor of this. First, that a philosophical argument that an actual infinite is impossible. Second, philosophical argument that you cannot form an actual infinite by successive addition. And then a set of empirical or scientific arguments that favor a beginning of the universe. We discussed how his first philosophical argument fails primarily because Craig attempts to show that certain thought experiments, such as Hilbert's hotel, are absurd, and therefore there can't be any actual infinite in reality, even though there's no clear basis on which Craig establishes that results are absurd. He's really just appealing to his intuition, and there's no reason to trust that. Also, there are clear differences between these thought experiments and the series of past events. So in Hilbert's hotel, you could always move the guests around, but you can't move around the series of past events. And Craig's response to that was just really unsatisfactory. Craig also makes other mistakes, like saying the fact that subtraction is undefined in Cantor's transfinite arithmetic somehow means that that's a problem for actual infinities in the real world, which it isn't. That's to confuse subtraction from the relative complement, which we talked about. We also discussed the question about whether an infinite regress of past events is an actual infinite, and discussed Craig's problem of trying to define the past in a way that it is real enough to count as an actual infinite, but not so real that it counts as existing, because remember, the past doesn't exist according to the presentist. And also he then faces the problem of distinguishing it from the future, which can't exist in any sense, because Craig doesn't want to say that the future has to be finite as well. So we talked about the whole host of problems that Craig faced trying to square that circle. With regard to the second philosophical argument, we talked about Craig's argument that you can't count up to infinity or count down from infinity, the argument about the number of orbits of Saturn and Jupiter and so forth, and the Tristram-Shandy paradox. Pretty much all of these are variations on the same theme. Craig's idea that it doesn't make sense to count up to or count down from infinity. You can't get to an infinity. You can't form a succession of past events from sequential addition. The problem with all of these arguments is that they rely on the assumption, whether or not Craig admits it, they are assuming that there's some sort of starting point that you then add to, because you can't just count, you have to count from something. And therefore, Craig's assuming that there's some starting point that we then somehow counted up to and reached an infinite past from that point, or we counted down from to reach the present. Both of those are false. If the past is infinite, there's always been an infinite number of past events, and there's no sense of we counted down or we accumulated or counted up from anything. All of those are mistaken and a faulty analogy. We also critiqued whether the temporal series of events even was formed by successive addition, because as we talked about, it seems that the past series of events could have been formed by a sort of a growing process, if indeed continuous growth, if time has the structure of the real numbers. And Craig's arguments against this, appealing to the Grimm-Upper's paradox, were not satisfactory. And as for the final set of arguments, the scientific arguments, well, we talked about how the Big Bang Theory itself doesn't really support Craig's argument because it doesn't say anything about the actual origin of the universe per se. We talked about the Bohr-Vilenkin-Guth theorem, which sort of says that the universe, at least the part of the universe that's describable using general relativity, had a beginning of finite time in the past. But the problem with that is that this only says that physical time, as measured in general relativity and four-dimensional space-time, it says that is finite into the past. And Craig, as I showed in many quotes, has very clearly and explicitly said that that the finitude of one type of time, physical time, does not imply the finitude of another type, metaphysical time, and that we cannot read any results about metaphysical time off of the findings of physics, that the two are separate domains. It should be interpreted instrumentally and so forth. So Craig really cannot interpret anything from the Bohr-Vilenkin-Guth theorem that's of interest for him in his Kalam. We also talked about quantum cosmology. Craig argues that any quantum origin of the universe must support a finite beginning of the universe, but we showed that this is based on a faulty assumption that a unstable quantum state or metastable quantum state could only exist for a finite period of time. But that's actually not true if the probability of decay is allowed to change and is not constant. And I provided a hypothetical example of that, but there are actual examples in literature as well, which discuss such models. We don't know if they're true. Of course, there are many possibilities, but it's far too premature to really rule anything out, and Craig's arguments are just not convincing in this respect. And finally, we talked about the second law of thermodynamics, and it's a similar point there. The question as to why the universe began in such a low entropy state is hotly debated in physics, and we don't really have an answer. But Craig's assertion that it points strongly to the finitude of the past is premature. We don't know if there is even a maximal entropy state, so maybe entropy's just been increasing for an infinitely long past, or at least in the multiverse. Or perhaps the multiverse as a whole is in a maximum entropy state, but we're in a fluctuation away from that. That's also consistent with what we know. And there's also some questions, such as how we assign the probability of microstates and things like that, that it's just way too premature to make any particular inferences about this, especially when Craig says that we can't infer anything about physical time from, we can't infer anything about metaphysical time from physical time. It's especially not going to work in that case. So I conclude that Craig has offered no real convincing arguments that the universe must have begun to exist, or in other words, that the universe is finite in the past. And that brings us to an end to the discussion of premise 2. So by now we've gone through the first two premises of the Kalam, of the extended Kalam, I should say, that time is tensed and that the universe began to exist. The next two premises are everything that begins to exist has a cause, so the causal premise. And finally, if the universe had a cause, then that cause must be personal, which gets us to God. And interestingly, we're already quite a lot of the way through the book. I think we're 77 pages in, and if we exclude the bibliography, the book is, let's say about 210. So we're nearly we're about a third of the way through the book, actually. That's because these first two sections are very long, because Craig has written, most of what Craig has written in philosophy is about these first two premises, philosophy of time and the beginning of the universe. His other main area of publication is the resurrection argument, which he's written a fair bit in as well. So we'll get to that section later. Everything else he's written much less on, so we'll be able to go through those sections rather more quickly. So the plan in the next video will be to tackle, hopefully we'll get through premises 3 and 4. Everything begins to exist. Everything that begins to exist has a cause, and the cause must have been personal, because those are shorter, and that will actually conclude the Kalam. And then we'll move on to subsequent chapters from there. So before finishing off, let me just have a quick look through chat as I did last time, in case there's anything I would like to respond to here. Yeah, so the unsatisfiable pair diagnosis seems to be an unnecessary introduction of a name on a trivial concept that takes about as much time to explain as saying the name. I basically agree, which is one of the reasons why I probably wouldn't really, if I was rewriting it, if I was doing a second edition, maybe I would add it in like one sentence to mention the fact that it's been described that way in the literature. But yeah, it's not really necessary. I think you just say it's impossible. But yeah, I kind of agree. Apparently, I was saying the wrong word at some point. I was saying transverse instead of traverse. Now, although I agree, I think I wanted to say traverse. Can you not say transverse as well? Maybe I'm wrong there. Let me check my dictionary. Transverse. Maybe you can't. This, according to this, is only a noun and adjective. It's not a verb. I will have to follow that up, but yes, my mistake. Is my book for beginners? My knowledge from Craig's philosophical arguments mainly comes from videos and it's only on the surface level. Well, I wouldn't say that my book is for beginners per se. I think that it is accessible to beginners because I explain everything. I don't assume any background knowledge. I don't use a lot of jargon. There is some jargon in the quotes, but I explain those. However, if you're a beginner to these things, you'll have to put work into it, right? I mean, what you could do is watch these series of videos if you want, and then I encourage you to also buy the book because I think it's a good reference guide, and I like to think that it's actually a good summary of all of Craig's apologetic work. I don't discuss his theological work here, but I do discuss his apologetic work, and so I think it will be useful as a future reference guide, and I think it sort of rewards further study, right? So I think it's accessible to beginners, but it will take some effort. It's not an easy read. I don't pretend that it is. I try to write it in a fairly clear way. I mean, there's things I could improve, I acknowledge, but honestly, compare it to Craig's academic books. You try to read one of his books like Time and Eternity, whatever it's called, and yeah, you think my book is difficult, you should try reading one of those. So yeah, I think that it's a good summary of a lot of the key issues of Craig. So I think it's also valuable for that purpose, but you don't need to know much about Craig to benefit from the book. I was thinking of reading Craig's book, Reasonable Faith, along with yours. Do you think I need a more beginner-friendly book to work myself up to? Extremely little physics if relevant. You don't need much physics. I mean, if you have a bit of physics, it won't hurt, right? It'll give you a bit of extra background. But like this book is also quite modular. I've separated out into premises and different arguments, so you can dip in and dip out of sections as you want. Again, I hope that it will serve as a reference guide to people when they're confronting Craig's arguments or people making arguments, and also to build your philosophical understanding. I think there's a lot of good stuff in here. I recommend reading Reasonable Faith if you're interested. If you read Reasonable Faith, you won't. Let me rephrase that. If you've read this book, you won't get that much new out of Reasonable Faith because I summarize pretty much everything that's in there. I mean, there's probably a few things here and there that is a little bit of extra detail. Like, I guess I don't discuss all of the arguments that Craig gives for his resurrection argument, for example, and there's various issues that I don't give as much detail as he does. But the substance of everything that he argues in Reasonable Faith is in here, as far as I know. I don't think there's anything major that I excluded. But it's always good, I think, to read both sides of it. And so, yeah, I fully encourage people, read Reasonable Faith, read my book, or whichever order you like. Make up your own mind about which arguments you think are more persuasive. Regarding inflation, doesn't it only imply a beginning if you assume inflation on average? Yes, that's true. Thank you, Long Lost Power, by the way, for a super sticker. That's correct. So currently it is thought that at least our observable universe has been inflating on average over its history. As to whether that applies to the multiverse as a whole, if there is such a thing, unclear. It is a commonly made assumption, though. But yes, that's true. It does depend on that assumption. When Craig attempts to define metaphysical truths that are somehow more limited than physical truths, I'm tempted to flip the table and walk off. In a sense, I think that's what he's hoping that you'll do. Or at least, you see, a lot of these responses that he makes are only present in the philosophical literature, occasionally on his blog and questions of the week. But a lot of these, especially in the first two sections of this chapter, are taken from philosophical papers. So here's his modus operandi. In his public debates and public videos and popular videos and so forth, and popular books, he gives the version of the argument that is most convenient, most convincing, right? Now, he knows that there are problems with these versions of the argument. When people bring them up, like in debates or questions or whatever, he will say, oh, I wrote a series of books on this, or I've discussed this in the philosophical literature, and he'll give you the citations. Knowing full well that essentially no one will ever read this stuff. Yes, there are a few people who will. Almost no one will. And particularly, almost even fewer will read like all of them, or like the majority of them. I mean, I can't claim to have read literally everything that Craig has written about apologetics, but I've read the majority of it. And certainly, Craig is terrible for self-plagiarization, by the way. He self-plagiarizes like crazy. Like whole pages of one book will just be reprinted with very little change in another book without a citation. But anyway, so there's a lot of repetition. But yeah, I've read a large portion of what Craig has written about the, again, apologetic side of things, not the theology side, although maybe I should dip into that at some point. But the point is, Craig knows that very few people will do that, and therefore he can make these inconsistent arguments. And maybe someone will pull him up in like a review of his book, like I quoted a few times, or someone like me will write a book, but then he could just ignore it, right? Which he's done for the last 4 years. So that's fine for him, because the purpose of these arguments is to keep people in the faith, and maybe bring a few who are convinced by these sorts of things. It's mostly to keep people in, right, who are doubting. That's pretty clear from what he said and what others also say. So yeah, it sort of doesn't matter if he makes like table flipping arguments, so to speak, which are kind of ridiculous. He can bury those in a journal somewhere and then, slather on some sort of plausible deniability philosophical language, like the past is part of the actual world whilst not existing. And then if someone calls him out on that, then he can appeal to some sort of modal realist argument or whatever about, well, something could be actual but not real or whatever. And that'll be published in a journal, and he could say he's responded to it. It doesn't matter if it's a good response, right? Like, it's irrelevant to him. He can just, as long as he has the plausible deniability, that's what matters. Everyone knows Craig sits around solving PDEs in his spare time. He doesn't have time for simple calculus. Yeah, so that's interesting, right? So I believe that Craig's undergrad was in communications. I don't quite know what that means. Was it media and communications? I hope I've got that right. I did look this up at some point. And yeah, his older writings don't show much of any familiarity with the physics. Certainly it's his newer writings where he appeals to a lot more of the literature. So it always raises, I've always wondered about this, how much of the physics, and the maths for that matter, when it comes to like infinities, how much of it does Craig actually understand? He knows enough to talk about it, because he can talk about these things, but yeah, it's hard to say. I don't think he understands it very well, to be honest. Like, for example, I don't think that he sat down like I did and read through that Born Good for Linker paper and worked through some of the math, because I actually did that, right? It's fairly simple math. I mean, I'm not claiming to be like a quantum cosmologist or anything like that, but I did study physics as an undergrad and a year of postgrad, and a fair bit of math. So I can at least like try to understand some of the details there. And I think that's kind of important, right? Not saying you have to be a mathematician or anything, but I don't know what level of mathematical sophistication Craig really has, and how much he's relying on what other people are telling him or his intuition or whatever. It's kind of hard to say, right? But yeah, like you would like to think that someone like Craig, who talks about this, would have spent some time, like working through your Calc 1 textbook to make sure he, understands some of the basics, right? You would like to think that. Whether that's true, I don't know. Oh, thanks, Spleen Face, for the dono. I was going to buy the book anyways. Thanks for doing this. Yeah, well, I do appreciate if people find this useful, that they would consider a purchase, either a digital or a soft copy. It's very cheap. You can get it for like $5 or $6 or something, maybe a little more if you're out of the US. But apart from anything else, and I do get a bit of money for that, but really it's more about the sales numbers, because that kind of helps to show that people are interested in my work, right? Which then helps if I want to publish things in the future. So that's sort of the more important thing. But yeah, there'll be a link to that in the description. Also, consider leaving a review on Amazon as well. If someone asked Craig, what is the derivative of x squared, do you think he'd know it? Yeah, I don't know. X squared's a pretty easy one, right? So I think probably, right? But if he didn't, he'd have something to say. If he didn't, his answer would sufficiently detract from the question such that it would still look like a win on his side. Because Craig is really good at weaseling out of responses like that, as I think I've shown. You can find the answer to that in my video number 3 on answers in Genesis. Craig or Ken Ham? Well, Craig doesn't agree with Ken Ham on quite a lot, actually, which is kind of interesting. All right, thanks for the questions, guys. And the donors as well. Appreciate that. So I'll finish up here. And thanks everyone for listening. Don't know when the next one will be out, but possibly soonish, because I said I do have a bit more time this week. But if it's several weeks, well, that's just how it goes. As I said, consider ordering a copy of the book if you found this useful. As I said, that does help support my work, and it's really quite cheap. Or leaving a review on Amazon, that's also appreciated. At the very least, give a like to the video. Thanks everyone. Talk to you in the next installment.